I've been a trucker for close to 15 years now. This happened to me in 2017. I was driving an overnight haul through the Mojave Desert in California, headed for a destination in Arizona. I think I was delivering appliances, I don't really remember. It was pitch black darkness in every direction. The headlights on my semi were really dim at the time, and I had been putting off getting them fixed forever. Usually I couldn't tell the difference, but since there were basically no other cars on the road, it was much more obvious. I remember having to strain my eyes every few minutes to make out the road in the distance. That could have been a horror story in of itself. I was debating pulling over for a couple hours and waiting for sunrise, but I didn't want to waste my time. I desperately needed the money at the time, so I kept driving even though it wasn't fully safe. I figured since it was basically a straight line it would be okay. I think it was about an hour before sunrise when I saw something approaching fast in the distance. Worried about hitting an animal, I slammed on the brakes. As my truck screeched to a stop, I realized what was in front of me, a car with its hazards on. The weird thing was that it was in the exact middle of the road, like literally on the double yellow. What was even weirder was that the passenger door was wide open. My truck stopped maybe a foot before hitting it. Not to toot my own horn, but I'm a pretty fearless guy, and I know my way around a bar fight. Because of this, I wasn't really scared when I saw the car. I was more curious than anything. I thought maybe someone needed a jump or something, so I reversed the semi and pulled over. I thought about throwing some flares down, but decided against it since I hadn't seen a single other car on the road besides this one. I got out of my truck and made my way over to the car. It was a warm, still night. I remember thinking how strange it was that there was almost no wind. It was also really quiet that night. The faint click of the hazards was the only sound in what felt like the entire desert. I got a little closer to the car. I vividly remember that it was a new-looking red Ford Fusion. I approached the car a little cautiously. Like I said, the passenger door was wide open. I walked around the car and stopped in my tracks. It was completely empty. I made sure of it too, checking the back seat and anywhere someone might be laying down. There was literally no one inside. All of a sudden, I was much less sure about the situation. I was expecting someone to need help of some sort, maybe even someone who took a nap in a really dumb spot. I certainly wasn't expecting this though. The car was literally empty. I cast a few glances over my shoulder, feeling a lot more uneasy now. I kept whipping my head around, looking in every direction. I felt like someone was going to charge me or something. The problem was, it was so dark that I couldn't see that far in front of me, except for what was lit up by my truck's headlights. It was eerie. I waited a while longer, thinking about getting back in my truck and forgetting about this whole thing. Someone was out there, somewhere. Against my better judgment, I decided to keep investigating. I looked inside the car, but everything seemed completely normal. The key was even in the ignition, although the engine was turned off. I got back out of the car and made my way over to the trunk. Might as well have a look, I figured. I went to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Locked. I grabbed the key out of the ignition and unlocked the trunk. Still though, the thing wouldn't budge. It was jammed from the inside somehow. I opened the back door and tried getting at the trunk through the back seat. To my surprise, it actually opened. There were 3 squished garbage bags back there, along with a rope that was tying the trunk closed. I remember glancing one more time over my shoulder before reaching for them. The coast was clear. I must have been within 5 inches from one of the bags when the loudest gunshot I've ever heard rang out into the night. I slammed my head on the roof of the car in shock. I didn't even think. I threw the keys on the front seat and got out of the car as fast as I could. As I was climbing into my semi, I heard a grungy voice yelling in the distance. He yelled "hey" a bunch of times, and his voice seemed to be quickly approaching. I scrambled into the semi and turned it on. I threw it in gear as fast as I could. I remember cursing a bunch of times as the engine initially stalled, and that's when I saw it. As my truck began pulling out, I saw a person standing at the trunk of the car. It was a short, husky guy with red hair. He was wearing overalls and shin-high boots. In his left hand, he was holding a small shovel. In his right, though, was an old-looking hunting rifle. We locked eyes for a few seconds as my truck began to drive past him. He didn't move. I remember him not looking crazy or anything. He had this worried look on his face. As I passed him, he dropped his shovel and started waving his hands. He yelled "wait" a few times, but I wasn't staying there another second. As I drove away, I watched in the rearview mirror as he ran after my truck for a few seconds before sprinting back to his car. It was clear he wanted me to stop, but there was absolutely no way I was going to do that. I stepped on it, pushing the semi much faster than I should have. I drove for like 5 minutes and started to think I was in the clear, but then I saw headlights fast approaching behind me. I remember feeling more scared than I've ever felt in my entire life. I called the police and told them what happened to the best of my ability. That's when the car was basically right on my tail. It started honking like crazy at me. I honestly didn't know what to do, so I just kept driving, praying to God he wouldn't try and ram me. After like 15 minutes of this, he cut in front of me and hit his brakes, forcing me to slow down. I was just about to crash into him when finally some flashing police lights appeared ahead. The Ford veered off to the right and sped into the desert, disappearing from sight. I pulled over and waited for the officer to show up. I frantically told him what had happened, but the useless cop decided to get a report from me rather than chase the guy down. I was so pissed about that. I told the guy like twice that he could probably catch up to him if he left now. The cop told me not to worry and that they'd do a thorough search as soon as backup arrived. He sent me on my way and said they'd call me if they ever had an update for me. They never did. None of my buddies have a story this crazy, and I've told it more times than I can count. I know what you're probably thinking. That guy was definitely burying bodies. That doesn't really explain why he had such a small shovel, or why he tried to follow me. The bags in his trunk were also too small for that, although some of my buddies think he might have done some dismembering. For my own sanity, I like to think that he was burying some other kind of animal, maybe putting a diseased dog out of its misery, or some dangerous snakes. I really have no idea. Either way, I've never been totally comfortable driving through deserts late at night after this experience. I'm sure you've seen some of the more modern videos online where truckers will document their daily routines and provide tips for each other. Or maybe you haven't. But being as I'm on the younger side in this industry, every time I open TikTok or YouTube Shorts, that's all I see. I won't get into it, but I had to drop out of a pretty prestigious university for some personal reasons, and people always tell me I could have been more than a trucker. It's honestly not a bad gig, though. I've been making deliveries for north of 2 years. Obviously, the only strenuous part of the job is the long hours. You can never truly gauge how the isolation will affect you without experiencing it firsthand. My only advice would be to make peace with whatever demons might be lurking in your subconscious, because they'll definitely eat at your brain in the lonely hours. That's what happened to me, anyway. This happened to me 3 months after getting employed by my first company. I was basically as new in this trade as one could get. I was driving from southern New Jersey to Lafayette, Indiana, a 12-hour drive. 12 hours driving might not seem that crazy, but factor in the fact that I just completed an 8-hour trip, and that should put things into perspective. I wanted to get deliveries done as quickly as possible, so I opted to drive through the night. I'd get to Lafayette just before 3 a.m. Things were going smoothly. There were virtually no other cars on the road, so I was able to push the semi a little faster than normal. About halfway through the drive, I remember reaching down at the center console to chug a Red Bull, but there weren't any. Of course, I had forgotten to restock my truck after completing my previous delivery. After slapping my dashboard a few times, I groaned in frustration, knowing I'd have to stop somewhere. There was nothing I hated more than having to make stops during my drives. I might be unique in this, but I always get exponentially more tired when my vehicle is immobile, even if I'm only stopped for like 20 seconds. After glancing up at the navigation, I figured I had no choice. Either fall asleep on the road, or stop and get an energy drink. In my brain, those options were pretty much equivalent. Reluctantly, I pulled into the first service stop I saw. I had literally no clue where I was, probably somewhere in Ohio at this point. Too late, I realized this wasn't actually a service stop. It was what looked like an abandoned gas station and a repurposed convenience store. I'm not sure if there's any better way to describe it. Either way, it looked like there was another quick stop store not far up the road, so I figured I'd go there if anything. I parked the semi and made my way over to the first convenience store. To be completely honest, I was expecting one of two things to happen. Either the place would be open or the door would be locked. You can imagine my surprise then, when the door swung open into a pitch black store. I looked around, hoping maybe I'd get lucky and there would be a drink or snack left behind. Just before I was about to turn around, my eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I picked up on a faint glow emanating from the corner of the room. I made my way over to it, and the glow turned out to be coming from a back room of some sort. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened the door slowly. To my pleasant surprise, there was a plugged-in refrigerator against the wall. Eagerly, I opened the door, but found nothing. Literally nothing. The shelves had literally been removed, like the whole appliance had been gutted. As I was shutting the door, I was 90% certain I heard a clatter from the main room, like something hitting the floor. I froze for a good 10 seconds. Had I imagined it? There was no way. Quietly, I walked back into the main room and looked around. Nothing. Part of me wanted to keep investigating. I didn't have time for this, though. I walked out the entrance door and basically jogged to the other shop. It was open, thank God. I paid for my drink and made it back to my truck. Something about this whole stop felt wrong. I needed to get back on the road as soon as possible. I took one last glance at the abandoned store and noticed the door was now open. I was 100% positive I had shut it behind me. It wasn't my job to figure out what was going on here, though, so I started the engine and merged my semi back onto the highway. The caffeine started kicking in and snapped me out of my tired haze pretty quickly. My mind began to wander, and I started thinking about how bizarre that whole thing had actually been. I guess a squatter in an abandoned building wasn't the strangest thing in the world, but my brain couldn't explain that refrigerator no matter what theory I thought of. I tried to forget about it and kept driving. It was then that I started noticing weird movements in the curtain behind me. Sweat started dripping down my forehead. I watched in the rearview mirror as the curtain seemed to billow and move, even though I didn't have the air on. I thought the worst. There was someone in my truck. I didn't have any weapons on me or anything, so I discreetly punched in the nearest police station on my phone. The drive there was the most tense and horrifying 20 minutes of my life. I kept imagining that person reaching out to grab me or trying to crash my truck. Finally, I approached the police station. I stopped the semi as close as I possibly could get and basically ran over to the police station. In seconds, my truck was surrounded by police, and after I opened the back, what I saw will stay with me for life. The police pulled out 3 homeless-looking people, 2 men and 1 woman. They were wearing rags and were wrapped in nasty-looking blankets. One of the men was armed with 2 switchblades. All 3 of them refused to talk, but stared menacingly at me as they were getting cuffed. I have no idea what they wanted. I don't think I'll ever know. My name is Kevin. I've been a trucker for varying companies for the better part of 15 years now. Things have become pretty routine at this point. Pick up the goods and materials, verify them for accuracy, and deliver them as instructed. We're not paid by the hour, so efficiency is the most important thing in this line of work. For someone like me who's been doing this forever, I like to think I can outwork all these young guns that are snapping these jobs up. This isn't always great though. Usually I push myself to the absolute limit when it comes to functioning on barely any sleep. 4 years ago, I was working for a warehouse based in North Dakota. For anyone who doesn't know, North Dakota is one of the flattest states, which makes trucking a little easier. This also meant that skipping out on a few hours of sleep could mean the difference between employment and getting the sack. It was a chilly Tuesday morning in May. The beginning of the week meant that more loads needed to be shipped, which meant more work for me. I wanted to knock it all out in one shot, so I traced my route into Montana accordingly, planning on not stopping even once to sleep. I hit the road a few hours after lunch, expecting to reach my destination very early the next morning. I pushed the semi as much as possible, doing maybe a couple over the speed limit. It was getting late, and I remember rubbing the crust from my eyelids as the clock ticked past midnight. I was having trouble keeping my eyes open, but I only had about an hour left in this drive, so I gritted my teeth and kept going. My buddy Tristan, who was also a trucker, introduced me to smelling salts when I first started out. If you don't know, smelling salts are basically some kind of crystals in a little bottle. One sniff and you're wide awake. You had to be careful though. Too many back-to-back uses could be dangerous, or at least that's what Tristan told me. They burn your nose a little bit, but whenever I needed a boost, I'd reach for the smelling salts first. This was one of those times. I took a big whiff and shot my head back, my reflexes taking over. I felt the adrenaline course through my body, and I hoped the feeling would last the rest of the drive. A half hour shot by, and I was really struggling. I felt myself start to doze off, and the blare of my truck drifting into the shoulder jolted me awake. This was getting dangerous, I thought. I had to pull off. I was all alone on the highway, but there was nowhere to pull off. There was just woods on either side of me. I slowed the truck down, searching desperately for somewhere to pull over. At this low speed, my headlights pierced through the darkness and I was able to see a lot more. As I looked around, I saw something that confused me. There was a purple dress lying in the middle of the road. What the hell? I thought, rubbing my eyes. Was I hallucinating? I blinked like 6 times just to make sure I wasn't going crazy. It was real. I approached the dress with my truck and stared at it as I rolled by. In hindsight, this should have been more of a red flag, but I think I was just too exhausted to process what was going on. About 200 or so yards away, I passed a pair of shoes. Now I was starting to freak out. What the hell was going on? I passed the shoes, praying to God there would be a place to pull off soon. My old man, David, was a super religious guy, so I clutched his old cross and hoped he would come through for me. A little further up the road, I saw a bunch more random clothing, some of which looked like little kids' clothing. This time I stopped the truck. The panic started to set in. Something was very, very wrong. I sat in the driver's seat with the truck at a standstill. I was expecting something to happen, but it never did. So I did what my instincts told me to do. I stepped out of the truck and went to inspect the clothing. I still remember the feeling of the chilly morning air piercing my skin, which definitely helped my exhaustion. I approached the pile as cautiously as I could. It was indeed kids' clothing. It looked like there were both boy and girl pieces of clothing in the pile. I looked around into the woods, but I couldn't see much of anything in the darkness. I had my head on a swivel, worried that this was some kind of trap. I decided it was not my business to figure out what was going on, so I made my way back to my truck. Just then, I heard a crunch from the left. I whipped around, trying to see what was there. I stood there, waiting to hear another sound. After about 30 seconds, there was another crunch, but this time from the opposite side of the road. My survival instincts kicked in, and I sprinted towards the truck. I jumped into the front seat, but just before I slammed the door, I heard a child's scream ring out. I froze, my heart bursting out of my chest. I was caught in a crossroads. I wasn't going to fight some random people in a pitch-black woods, but I couldn't just abandon some helpless kids either. Before I could make a decision, another almost identical child's scream rang out. Without thinking, I turned the truck on and pointed its nose toward the spot in the woods where I heard the noise. My headlights lit up about 30 yards into the woods. There were 3 or 4 people, one of whom was holding a massive speaker. They ducked behind a couple trees as my truck lit them up, but I had exposed them for just enough time to make out what they were doing. They hid from the light before I could really make out any distinctive features, but I swear on my old man David's grave, they were holding up a speaker, trying to lure me into the woods with a fake kid screaming. I was just in shock. I just sat there, staring at the trees those people had just hid behind. I reached for my phone to call the police, but before I finished dialing, I heard a thump from the body of the truck. Someone had thrown something from the other direction. I was done. I turned back to face the road and slammed on the gas. As I sped off, I could make out a person on the other side of the road. He shouted something I couldn't understand before launching something at the truck that cracked the glass of my passenger side window. I drove the final hour in silence. I was too scared to process what had just happened, but there was no way in hell I was stopping to sleep in those woods. I completed my delivery and then knocked out. I must have slept for 10 hours straight. When I woke up, the first thing I did was call the police, who told me they'd investigate those woods and give me any updates. I then thought about the whole thing and how stupid I was to get out of my truck. I should have just minded my own business. But the thought of some kids being kidnapped or worse was just too much for me to ignore. To this day, I still have no idea what those people were trying to do. I don't know why they didn't just rush me when they had the chance, or what they were planning to do to me if I ran out in the woods after the kids screaming. In all my years of being a trucker, nothing has ever come close to being as strange or downright terrifying as this experience. When I was in university, I would take 6 courses every semester because I was doing a dual degree, and I wanted to get it all done in 4 years. This meant a lot of semesters I was up to my neck and ears in homework and studying all the time. My university had a library that was open until midnight. I was also interning this semester, so I really had almost no time to do my work. I still lived on campus at this point, and my suite mates could be very loud and distracting sometimes. This was a Wednesday night, so I had 3 classes that day and my internship. I also had 2 exams the following day, so right after I finished up at my internship, I went straight to the library. Our campus library was very big. When I got there at 9 p.m., there was still a decent amount of people everywhere, but from 9 to 10 it quiets down a lot, and I was planning on being there until 12 studying for my 2 exams the next day. Around 11, most people were gone, but there were still some around. I was sitting at one of the tables sandwiched between 2 bookshelves on either side, so it was a little more private and secluded where I was sitting. Less distractions. By 11 o'clock, some guy who looked to be in his upper 20s came into the section and passed one of the multiple empty tables and came to mine, where he sat down diagonally across from me at the table. I looked up, and he looked back at me and smiled as he was setting his books down. I looked back down and just tried to focus on my studying, and not wonder too much why he decided to sit at my table. I was going through the slides to study on my laptop, when the guy at my table said excuse me, then asked me if I by chance was taking a specific economics course. I politely told him no, sorry, hoping that would be the end of it, but then he started explaining why he asked that, because his quote-unquote professor is a bitch and gives pop quizzes every day. I said, wow, that really sucks. Then I tried to go back to studying. Mentally, my mind wasn't completely into the material anymore now. Now I was distracted by the presence of this man, who I had a feeling was going to keep trying to talk to me. I looked up from my laptop screen and saw that man looking at me, smiling with his lips. I looked back down at my laptop, contemplating getting up and moving elsewhere, or just leaving. He then asked my name. I made up a name and said Chelsea. He said, "You have such blue eyes, Chelsea." This was when I started to wonder if this man was really here to study or creep on women, and the fact that he looked like he was almost 30 didn't help. I asked him what the name of his economics professor was. He took a second, then said Professor Davis. I asked if he knew the first name. He shook his head no. I went straight to ratemyprofessor.com and looked up any professors with the last name Davis at our school, and only one came up, a calculus professor whose last reviews were left years ago. I decided to get up and go ask the security worker at the front door for help. As I got up, I felt the stare of that man at the table watching me walk over to the security worker and tell him that this man was creeping me out and I don't think he's a student. The security worker walked back over with me and asked to see the man's student ID. He started looking through his wallet, then his pockets, and then he said he must have left it at his dorm. The security worker then asked what dorm building he's in. The guy was clearly lying because he didn't know what to say, and eventually just said, "I honestly don't remember what it's called." The security worker walked him out of the library, and he came back and told me to just be careful while walking back to my dorm. I thanked him. The whole rest of the time at the library, my mind was so distracted just thinking about what a creep that guy was. I did my best to keep studying, and around 12, I knew it was time to wrap it up so I could get some sleep. I packed up and left through the same way the security guard escorted that man out. He wasn't standing there at that moment. I don't know where he went. I started walking through the basically deserted campus. No one walks around that late on a Monday to Wednesday night. That's why eventually, when I was nearing my dorm building and I heard at least one loud sound of a shoe hitting the concrete behind me, I turned around, but I saw no one there. I knew for a fact I heard a footstep though. I started to run now, which may have been a mistake, because the second I started to run, which was made more difficult because of my backpack, I heard running footsteps behind me. I turned and saw that man from the library sprinting towards me. I screamed at the top of my lungs, but only for a second before I was tackled to the ground and had a hand over my mouth. He kept threatening me, saying, "You better shut up or I'll kill you." I genuinely thought my life was about to end. I was trying to call out for help still, but it was muffled by his hand. He then got to his feet and started to drag me by the throat out of sight of the main walkways, and I saw he was dragging me in the direction of the woods right by the dorms. I managed to remove his hand from my mouth for just long enough to scream again. It was enough to get the attention of these two guys who came running over yelling, "Hey, stop," at my kidnapper. The man let go of me and started running off towards the woods. The two guys came over to me, and I'm sure they were asking me if I was okay and whatnot, but I blocked all noise out for a few moments, and I was in total shock. I completely let my emotions out and started bawling my eyes out. The two guys called university police, and I did my best to keep myself together and explain. We went to the library to ask the security worker for his description of the man as well. It matched my description of the man. The police were also able to use the footage from the library cameras to get a clear picture of the man's face. The picture was sent out to all students' phones and emails and the school website, and that same night, there was an anonymous tip that the man was at a late-night dive bar down the road from the school. The police arrived to the bar and arrested him. The level of trauma this induced on me was incredible. I can't even imagine the trauma for those who weren't as lucky as me in situations like this. We moved to a new town when I was 7. Any memories before that move I consider to be very early childhood, and a lot of those memories are blurry at this point. This is one of those memories. This happened at some age before 7, I know that. If I had to guess, I was 5, maybe 6. There was the local town library that our mom would always take my brothers and I to. It was a few blocks away, actually. I remember this one day. It was my mom and my little brother, who was a toddler at this point. We started the day at the mall. Probably spent hours there tagging along with our mom shopping. Whenever we'd go to this mall, she'd always bring us to the McDonald's inside the mall to get us ice cream cones. I remember we got ice cream on this particular day, because on the way to the library after leaving the mall, I still had some of the cone left in my hand. We arrived to the library, and there was this kids' computer section that my mom would let me stay at and play computer games while she went and did whatever she'd do. When I got bored of playing whatever old online computer games there were at the time, I got up and started walking through the aisles of books in the kids section of the library, looking for the I Spy books. The kids section was in the far corner of the library, and while I was walking from aisle to aisle, I heard a psst from behind me. I turned around and saw nothing. I was looking at the back wall of the library, which had another shelf of books leaning on it. Then I saw half of a grown man's face peer around the shelf and said, "Peekaboo." I remember laughing and feeling no sense of danger. He did it again. He went back behind the shelf, then peered out his head again and said, "Peekaboo." Again, I laughed. He asked me what I was looking for, and I said the I Spy books. He said he'll help me find it. He came over and took my hand and started leading me through the aisles, leading us, I guess, to the section of books that began with the letter I. And there they were, at least 5 I Spy books next to each other. I grabbed my favorite one, the treasure hunt one, and he said, "Let's go sit down and play." He led me to a table in the corner by a couple children's computers, and we started looking through the pictures. This went on for some time, and he was asking me questions about myself as we played I Spy. The question that still sticks out to me the most is, "Who are you here with?" And I told him my mom and little brother. At some point after this, he said something implying that there's a kid's playroom downstairs, and I, at that age, never knew that there was a downstairs to the library. He said we could take the book down there. He led me to the door that led to the basement of the library, which, for reference, is actually where events and meetings for certain clubs and organizations are held. And there is actually a little playroom down there, I guess for parents who have to bring their kids with them during any of the meetings. The man led me to that little playroom. There were various toys in there, most notably a Lego set and a Lego table, and then there were a bunch of chairs. He set the I Spy book down on the Lego table. This is where things get really uncomfortable thinking back on. As he was trying to forcibly get me to play with the toys, I started to get uncomfortable. And around this time, over the loudspeaker, a female librarian said into the intercom, "Will Liam come to the front, please? Your mother is looking for you." At this time, the man went to turn off the lights in the room, and now it was pitch black inside. He said in the dark, "We're gonna play hide and seek." This was the first moment I was genuinely freaked out, and I started to yell for my mom. I remember he kept telling me to be quiet, and his voice was getting louder as he was getting closer to me in the dark, until he had his hands on me. I thankfully managed to run past him and out the door of that room, and I ran down the dark hallway back to the stairs, and as I was running up the stairs, I had that same childhood feeling of running up the basement stairs after turning off the lights, only 100 times worse, because I genuinely was scared I was going to be grabbed. I made it back to the main floor of the library and ran straight to the front desk, calling for my mom. She was at the front desk with a group of librarians, and I remember the relief on my mom's face when she saw me. I told her there was some man who took me downstairs, and she literally lost it. The next thing I remember from there was a bunch of police in the building searching around, but I never saw that man again. He must have exited the building through a different way. I remember speaking to some woman who was probably with the police, asking me very delicate questions. I never really asked my mom about this experience that many times, because it's very uncomfortable, and I'd rather just not think of it. I used to work at the local public library when I was in my early 20s. I'd work the night shifts as my second job at least 3 times a week after my first job. I'd get there at 6 and would work till closing time at 9. I would also be the one to lock up the place after closing, but I wouldn't just leave right after the library would close. I'd have to shut off all the computers, do some cleaning and organizing, stock the shelves with all the returned books and DVDs from the day, take out the garbage, and only then could I leave. It was a Friday night, approaching closing time. Most of the other library staff was gone already. It was just myself and one of the female librarians left. I had made a couple last call announcements to the remaining library patrons, alerting them that the library would be closing soon. I was already cleaning up the place, trying to finish up early so I could leave and just start my weekend. The only other employee still there said goodbye to me as soon as the clock struck 9 o'clock. I announced on the intercom that the library was closed. The 2 guests that were left got up from their tables and started packing up their things before leaving through the door. After that, when I saw no one else in the building, I locked the front door. I proceeded to start fixing all the chairs to be neatly tucked under their tables. Then I started emptying all the garbage cans, and when it was time to bring them outside to the dumpster on the side, I unlocked the front door again and brought them out. It was quiet outside. The library was kind of tucked away from any main roads. When I came back inside, I locked the door again. Now all I had to do was restock all the returned books and DVDs from the day. I grabbed the 2 boxes and started with the DVDs, which was easier since the DVD section was smaller. It took about 5 to 10 minutes. During this time, I thought for sure I heard something come from one of the book aisles. I started walking through the aisles till I found an open book laying on the floor, which had clearly just fallen off the shelf. I put it back in its place, and for a second I stood there and just wondered, how could that have happened? I went back to work, and after finishing the DVDs, I took the box of books and started putting them one by one back on the shelves. Going in alphabetical order, I started with the A's. The books in the box were sorted in alphabetical order to make it easy. As I worked my way down the shelves trying to bang this out and go home, I heard another noise nearby. 2 times in less than 20 minutes. That was no coincidence. I set the box down and started walking through the aisles of books again. I found another 2 books on the ground in another aisle. Someone was in here. I walked out to the open area with all the tables and such and yelled out, "Excuse me, the library is closed." There was silence, until I heard something from across the library, from the children's section. I approached the noises, and it started to sound like some rabid animal making growling sounds. I also heard books being thrown onto the floor, It was coming from one aisle. As I built up the courage to peek down the aisle, I saw some woman wearing a nightgown throwing random books off the shelf, making these disgusting animal-like sounds. I didn't say anything. I turned and ran to the office where we had the phone. I didn't have a cell phone at this time. I locked the office door and closed the blinds to the window. Then I called 911. I reported that there was some sickly woman in the library and I think they should send an ambulance. They asked if I had approached the woman, and I said no, she looked like she could be dangerous. When the operator asked me if the woman was still in the same spot, I opened the blinds and I screamed because that woman was right on the other side of the glass looking in. Her pupils were so big that she looked demonic. I said to the operator, she's right outside the office. The woman started to bang on the glass, screaming gibberish. She tried opening the door, and when it didn't open, she turned around and sat on a chair facing the office. The operator asked me to keep the blind open and watch her. The woman was wobbly as she sat down, so I noted she was definitely high out of her mind. 2 police cars and an ambulance showed up to the library. The woman was put in handcuffs because she tried fighting the police officers, but nothing she was saying made any sense. She was put in the back of an ambulance and was taken away. I never found out what the hell she was on. I don't know how she got inside. Maybe while I was taking the garbage out, or maybe she was inside before I even locked the place up. Either way, it definitely made being in the library alone after closing pretty unsettling from there on out. If you ever check your spam folder in your email, there's a chance at one point you received an email with one of your passwords in the title, and inside the email would be threats of leaking your information or worse unless you paid a certain ransom, usually in Bitcoin. This usually happens when a hacker, or even often a regular user, will likely find this info by merely searching any of the numerous data breach databases available on criminal forums. In March of 2019, a 25-year-old man named Joe Albanese received a similar email to what was just described. It was titled his password that he used for every account that he had. This was obviously a cause for alarm, so he opened it immediately to read the contents of the email. This is what it said. Hey Joe, all you really need to know is that I know your password and other personal information. I won't come after you, I won't harm you, as long as you send me a small amount of money, $5,000 in the form of Bitcoin. We're going to refer to it as a donation for a good cause, not as any kind of blackmail. My Bitcoin address is... If you don't send me the money, bad things may happen. Don't even bother going to the police. This email is untraceable. Joe did some research and learned that these kinds of threatening emails are common scams, and usually nothing will come of them. Still, Joe replied to the email asking, what other personal information of mine do you currently possess? I'd love to know. He sent this as a sort of challenge to the email, not even really expecting a response or for it to even go through. But it did, and he promptly received a response back saying, I know your home address is F. If you go to the police, I will know about it and you will be sorry. This is when worry would really set in with just about anyone, as having a password leaked in a data breach is one thing, but some unknown person having your home address threatening you with it is completely next level. Joe didn't reply to the email for several days, but he also didn't go to the police. He decided to wait it out and see what would happen next, and after 3 days, there was a follow-up email saying, I'm still waiting for the payment. I won't wait much longer. Joe replied this time saying, I'm not paying you $5,000. If you want to come to my house, you'll get a face full of lead. This was a complete bluff though, as he doesn't actually own a gun, and the hacker likely knew that because that same night, Joe received a follow-up email containing a picture of his house. It was the side of his parents' house and zoomed in on his bedroom window upstairs. He didn't want to tell his parents in fear of worrying them, but now that his gun bluff didn't work, he knew he may have to get them or the police involved. He responded one more time saying, I don't have $5,000. I'm broke paying off student loans. The house you sent a picture of is my parents' house. They did nothing wrong. If you need to do this, please do it to someone else. I don't have the money to send you even if I wanted to. There was no response this time, but within an hour, the sound of glass shattering from downstairs traveled throughout the house. And everyone, including his parents, heard it. There was one of their decorative bricks from the front of the house, laying in the dining room among thousands of tiny shards of glass from the broken window. Joe tried to explain the situation as quickly as he could, and while he and his dad took a quick look outside for anyone who could be out there, his mother called the police. Joe showed the police officers the emails and everything, which were forwarded to the police department. A police officer stayed parked outside the Albanese house for a couple hours that night. Joe blocked the email address from sending any further emails, and as far as he knew, he was never contacted again. The police had a hard time tracing back the original source of the email, as it was sent from an untraceable device, likely an iPod Touch or similar device. At some point, everyone imagines being famous in their lives. A lot of people create this image in their head that being in the public eye creates for nothing but a fairy tale life. But that's far from the truth. Being under the spotlight in any capacity comes with a lot of drawbacks, one of which being stalkers and overly obsessed fans. One extreme case of this, an ex-radio host and DJ who was centered in Los Angeles, had a long, seemingly never-ending chain of emails from an obsessed fan. It started around 2005 or 2006 when the DJ started noticing a regular listener, someone who listened to the show every day and would call in on the request line from time to time. At one point, the listener won a prize from the show, and in order to deliver the prize, the DJ requested her email, and that's where things began. In order to be polite and cordial with the girl, he would answer all of her emails, and when Facebook started to become popular, he added her back where she commonly liked and commented on his posts. This went on for a while, until one day the fan professed her love for him. The DJ rejected this advance in the most polite way he could. She seemingly accepted the rejection, and the DJ thought it would be the end of it, but it wasn't. In 2011, she emailed him a link to a blog that she was writing, where she would post about him and their quote-unquote love multiple times per day. She followed him over to a new radio station and was religiously listening to his shows, assigning meaning to the musical playlist. For example, the song Marry Me by Train was popular at the time, and whenever that song would play on his show, she would blog about it actually being a marriage proposal from the DJ. She began saving all his photos from his social media and photos of other women in his life, like friends and girlfriends, and posting them to her blog with extremely hateful words. She'd make posts raging about him being a man whore, followed by another post not even 10 minutes later in a completely different tone, apologetic and soft, implying she may have bipolar tendencies. The DJ did his best to ignore it, even though by this point he was extremely creeped out, but as she again began emailing him, he tried more forcefully this time to get her to stop, but she wouldn't stop. The DJ started sending DMCA requests to her blog host from the photos of his that she had posted. The repeated violations got her blog shut down, but then she started emailing him instead of posting blogs. He made a filter folder so he never would have to see them aside from occasionally peeking at the insanity in the folder from time to time, just out of curiosity. Years went by and he hadn't answered any of her emails after 2 of them when he very adamantly told her to stop all communications and leave him alone. This continued for years, and in total she has sent him over 4,000 emails, all of which he's archived. This is a picture of just a select few of them. The more recent emails had gotten very dark and violent in tone. In one of the most recent ones, she was threatening to find and hurt the DJ and happily go to jail for it. In another one, she listed the specific neighborhood in which he lived, which he worries she may have his address if she already knew what town he lives in. In an effort to stem the flow of information, he deleted all of his social media accounts a while back, but she would still email him pictures he appeared in from his friends who had public profiles, as well as radio station photos that he appeared in. Most disturbingly, she sent the DJ photos of a shrine she had made of him in her home, with framed photos of his social media that she had posted up on the walls, desks, etc. Being a DJ, his appearance schedule must remain public, so she could technically find him working at nightclubs anytime she wants to, and understandably he's freaked out and worried about his safety. After calling multiple attorneys, none seemed very interested in helping him with this matter. Due to his fear of facing the girl in real life or even being in the same room as her, he never went through with filing a restraining order. He also worried that on the off chance she didn't have his home address, the legal process would reveal it to her. To my knowledge, there was never any follow-up with this, and it's not known if the harassment continued or what route the DJ pursued, if any. But this is one of those extreme cases of how a fan's obsession could have a very negative effect on someone's well-being and mental health. In this last one, a viewer who wanted to be referred to as Christian received multiple emails that he wanted me to share in a story video. Christian has a friend named Katie who was out for a job interview. They used to be co-workers, which is how they met. Nothing was out of the ordinary until Christian started to try and contact Katie after her interview was supposed to be done, only to find that his texts weren't delivering and calls were going straight to voicemail. It was very possible that her phone could have been off or she had no cell service. but as hours passed and still nothing was delivering, he started to get concerned. The most likely and obvious possibility was that she lost or broke her phone, but finally, hours later, the text said delivered. However, Kate never replied. That same day, as Christian was checking his email, he saw an email from Katie's old work email. He opened it, and it read, "Hey, I lost my phone and keys. Can you come pick me up? I'm by some old warehouse construction looking building in the parking lot across from a Hyatt place." Christian asked when she last had her phone and if she had any idea how she lost it. She replied, "I have no idea. Just come soon, please. It's cold." The address that she then sent to better help Christian get to her said it was 20 minutes away. But looking at the location of the address on the map, it led to some abandoned-looking warehouse parking lot, evident by the green growing in the parking lot and decaying-looking rooftop. Christian sent another email back, demanding she go to a less sketchy pickup point. She took a few minutes to answer back with, "I'm already sitting on a bench here. I'm comfortable, just please hurry." Christian got in his car and started following the directions to the location he was told to go. But about halfway there, he stopped the car when he had a thought. And that was, how is she using her laptop to email him in the middle of some random parking lot by an abandoned warehouse? While it was maybe possible that there was some free Optimum Wi-Fi nearby or something, it did seem very unlikely. This is where Christian became suspicious of the whole thing, and the fact that she was using her laptop to contact him instead of going to the hotel across the street and calling him just made it seem more suspicious. He tried calling her number a few times, and now it was ringing instead of going to voicemail. On his third try, the phone rang twice and somebody picked up for a second, though most likely on accident. By this point, Christian was suspicious all of Katie's things were stolen. He called Katie's brother to tell him about the situation and ask his opinion, but when he asked first thing, "Have you heard from Katie?" Katie's brother said she had been home for 2 hours, and that her entire backpack and phone were stolen. Christian yelled into the phone that he was being led into some sketchy parking lot at that very moment by someone who was on Katie's email, most likely on her laptop. Christian drove to Katie's house immediately to pick the two of them up, and they called her phone and left a voicemail with all three of them yelling threats of what they'd do if they didn't return the phone and laptop, which probably went unheard if the thief didn't have her passcode. They also sent a number of texts which went unresponded to. After calling the police and requesting assistance in the parking lot, a police car did show up, but the entire parking lot was abandoned as expected, and no further emails were received. Kate's phone was never turned on again. It was likely disposed of. She never got any of her stuff back, but on the bright side, Christian may have avoided being lured into some kind of trap that would have led to him being robbed or harmed. When I was in high school, I had a couple of close friends, Jason and Brian. We did quite a bit together, and when it came time to graduate, Jason had to move away to Lexington, South Carolina with his family due to his father's work. After we graduated and he had completed his move with his family, my friend Brian and I were invited to pay a visit for a weekend to his new house. We decided out of boredom to start hiking around in the nearby forest and countryside, which we found had a scenic river. It was a beautiful area and felt quite peaceful, but we ended up getting lost. We decided to keep following the river as we lost track of which direction was upstream or downstream, with no sounds of civilization anywhere we could hear. We quickly became concerned about finding a telephone to call Jason's mom or dad to get us from wherever we were, even though there was no paved road or street that we could find nearby. As we kept following the river, we came to this old church-looking building made of really old red bricks with a dirt parking lot and a dirt road leading up to it. It was very encroached with growth and bushes. We decided to go inside and see if there were people, and maybe ask to use their telephone and get the address for this location. We noticed there were a few old cars which looked to be 70s or 80s, possibly Novas, 4 of them. Very dirty and rusted in this dirt parking lot with flat or missing tires. They were all white colored, or used to be, and parked in a row side by side. As we got closer, we heard gospel music sounds and some singing inside the church. We were relieved that there were people, so we went into the church, which appeared to be rather old and dilapidated. We peeked past the main doors to the hall and saw what I estimated was a couple dozen people dressed as nicely as they could, though they clearly were poor. When we went inside, the old white-haired woman wearing horn-rimmed glasses who was playing the church piano stopped playing
and she looked at us with no expression on her face. What happened next really stuck with me, and I will never forget it as long as I live. Everyone in that church stopped singing and put down their song sheets, and they all slowly turned their heads and looked at us with the most vacant and unwelcoming glares. Jason said, "We're sorry to interrupt. We just want to use your phone to call my folks to come get us." Nobody spoke. It was dead silent in that church other than the wooden pews creaking from the weight of the people in them. So we just slowly backed out of the door and let it close behind us, and looked at each other in ominous fear and quietly left. We started walking up that dirt road, and when Brian mentioned that there were no crosses or anything Christian in there, we looked back up the road to see that maybe a dozen of those people, all men, had walked out in the front of the church and were standing there watching us intently as we walked along the road. This freaked us out, and we began to sprint up that dirt road for what felt like a good half hour. We finally came to a very old, broken down gas station that looked like one of those old full service stations. We went inside to find that the shelves were mostly empty and dusty from a quick glance, and an old, overly tanned, swarthy man with a really oily and dirty baseball cap was behind the counter reading some old book with ragged edges and yellowed pages. He looked up and said, "You boys lost, huh? Just head out that way you came in and make a left, and follow that road till you see a telephone pole, and just go right at the pole down the trail and it'll take you to a highway." We thanked the man and left quickly, and as we walked down the road to the telephone pole the man told us about, again looked back, and the old man was out in front of the gas station with his arms folded, just staring at us with a rotten-toothed grin on his face. We got to the pole, made the right, and followed that trail to the nearest highway, after about a good half hour of walking in the twilight. It had just gotten dark as we got to the highway, and we tried to wave down a few people passing by, but nobody stopped. Thankfully, a police officer saw us and pulled over to help us. We told him we were lost and gave him Jason's address, to which he whistled and said we really were lost. It took about 30 minutes for that officer to drive us back to Jason's, and during the chit-chat, he told us we needed to be careful out in those woods, as there are some crazy witch folks in it. A long time ago, I'm talking like 8 years ago, two friends and I, James and Sean, did something really stupid. But at the time, doing stupid things was what we did to pass the time. We're not really friends with James anymore, but Sean and I still talk often, and so oftentimes we'll talk with each other about this story. We were 19 years old. We lived in bumfuck New Jersey. Lots of vacant houses in our old town. And atop a hilly road not far from our houses was an abandoned church. Locals knew about the church. It was on a closed-off road, and it had been abandoned for many years. I'm not sure if it's still standing or what the current state of it is, as I live in Florida now. But James, Sean, and I, being the troublemaking thrill-seekers we were, came up with this genius plan of bringing a Ouija board to the church late one night. This was October, so I guess we were doing it in honor of spooky season. Sean had the Ouija board in his closet, so he brought it. I drove the three of us, so I first picked up James, then Sean, and we just drove straight towards the church. Since the road up the hill to the church was literally blocked off, we had to park on the side of the road and walk from there. We followed the road up the hill to the church, using one flashlight at first, so as not to overdo it and draw any possible attention. But once we were atop the hill, we pretty much all three of us turned on our flashlights. The church was surrounded by woods in basically all directions, and had a gravel parking lot alongside it. The church had been broken into 1,000,000 times before, and was littered with graffiti, so the big front door was already ajar. Two of us had to work together to pull it open because it scraped on the floor though. Once inside, we naturally just looked around the place with our flashlights to make sure no one else was in there. It was definitely creepy being in that place at night. Sean set up the Ouija board. Then he pulled out these 3 candles from his backpack as well, and he laughed and said it would add to the experience. He placed the 3 candles in a triangle formation around the board, and as they were all lit, we turned off our flashlights. Now the only light in the whole place was from the candles, creating a much more eerie and uncomfortable vibe. We really couldn't see more than maybe 6 feet in all directions, so we began playing with the Ouija board. Sean was doing most of the talking. At this point, I can't remember exactly what he said, but he definitely opened with "Is anybody there?" and the typical cliche Ouija board questions. The planchette started to move, and we started to laugh. I knew it was one of them doing it. I feel like it's not possible to play with a Ouija board with your friends without someone jokingly moving around the planchette. We went along with it though, and whoever was moving it spelled out a few words. As this was going on though, we heard a weird crack type sound come from the altar of the church. Best way I could describe it is it sounded like a big piece of wood cracking in half. It was loud and it sounded like it was done by someone. We all jumped in reaction and hurried to shine our phone's flashlights in the direction of the altar. There was no one there as far as we could see. I think both of them were just as freaked out as I was after that. But the place was old and falling apart, so some weird noises here and there didn't seem that crazy, and so we kept going. We all took turns asking the board questions, but the planchette was no longer moving. I think because that crack sound freaked all three of us out, and now we were taking it more seriously. This went on for some time, until another sound from the altar area broke the silence again. But before we even had time to shine our lights over there again, something landed on the Ouija board, causing all of us to jump and scream. It was a rock about the size of a golf ball. All three of us just had our hands on the planchette 2 seconds ago, and there was no way any of us could have done that. We all three got up and ran back out of the church screaming, leaving the Ouija board and candles behind. We ran all the way down the hill and back to my car, and fearing we were being chased, we didn't stick around. I drove us all back to James's house, where we just sat in the car for a good half hour talking, wondering what exactly just happened. Sean is very religious and superstitious as well. He was confident we had reached a spirit of some kind. I don't really believe in any of that stuff. I believe there was someone else in the church with us, which I find to be equally terrifying. Sean went back to the church the next day with James to get his Ouija board back. And to make things even stranger, the Ouija board was missing, but the candles were still in place. When they saw it was missing from the entrance, they decided to just leave right away. This remains to be the single scariest experience of my life. This happened in Warren County, Georgia, a very rural inland part of the state. I was with my girlfriend Marissa, and we were driving around checking out the area, seeing if it was somewhere we'd like to live. It was very quiet and spacious, which is what we wanted. We're both Roman Catholic. She likes to go to church a little more than I do, though. It was a weekday in the middle of the day, and not much traffic at all. We checked out a bunch of things in the area that would be important to see before deciding on moving to an area. Since Marissa has been an equestrian for most of her life, a big point of us moving to a rural area was for her to have a barn for her horses. After checking out some properties listed for sale, we happened to pass by a small, cute-looking church on the side of this very quiet road with a bunch of cars in the parking lot. This church wasn't far from the last property we just looked at, so Marissa shook my shoulder and said we should see if a mass was going on, see if it's nice. And so I pulled into the little dirt-like parking lot for the building and parked next to some old red minivan. A lot of the cars in the parking lot were on the older side. In fact, I'd say most of them. I mentioned that to Marissa as we got out of the car, and she agreed and said it was probably because it was a lower income area. I opened the door to the church for us and we stepped in, and it was a pretty small inside as we expected. I'd say there were 5 rows of pews, each cut in half in the middle by the nave, or center aisle. There had to be at least 20 people in there, though they were not an older crowd. Usually in every mass, big or small, you'd see a decent amount of seniors, but based on the backs of everyone's heads in there, everyone appeared to be in their 30s to 40s. It seemed everyone was sitting in silence for some kind of prayer. As we sat down in the back, the people closest to us started looking at us, like one at a time, and as others noticed the staring, they would look to see what the others were staring at and then look at us. Marissa and I looked at each other, then nervously looked back at everyone. All we could think to do was smile, but no one smiled back. They were giving us the most unwelcoming stares, and I just realized none of these people were dressed even remotely nicely for a mass. What was going on here? This was when I realized there were no women in here, not a single one besides Marissa, and the stares, they seemed to be staring more at Marissa than me. A man in a mask at the front of this alleged church, by what I guess was supposed to be the altar, then stepped up and pointed at us and said, "Who invited you here?" I took it upon myself to answer for us, and said that we were just passing by and saw that a mass was going on and we wanted to join. The man was clearly not a priest, and this was clearly not a Roman Catholic church. The masked man said, "You need to leave now." By now, every last person in the church was looking at us. I said, "Come on, honey," and we got up and hurried out and ran to the car. We wasted no time sitting in the car. I got us out of that parking lot right away, but we both noticed in the rearview mirror someone from the building getting in their van in the parking lot. I felt like there was no way they were going to follow us until we saw that gray van catching up to us in the mirror. I had Marissa GPS the Warren County Sheriff's Office, and we drove straight there. The van was behind us the whole time, not on our ass, but close enough that it was obvious. The second we pulled into the public safety parking lot, the van kept driving down the road. When it was gone, we simply drove straight home and never looked at Warren County again. We clearly ended up in some kind of cult meeting, but I don't get why they had someone follow us, nor why they were having their meeting in broad daylight, or why they didn't at least lock the door. When I was a Cub Scout, we would always have our meetings somewhere in a Catholic elementary school, whether it was in the school gym or in one of the adjacent rooms. I was like 8 years old when this happened, and it was disturbing. But before I get into why I'm telling you that, let me start from the beginning. It started a few days earlier when I was at Mass with my mom and my brother like we'd go to every other week. We usually would be late, so we'd either sit in the back or stand by the doors if there were no seats. Today, we sat all the way in the back corner. My mom and then brother entered the pew first. I sat on the end. At some point during the Mass, I noticed an older man with glasses and a white mustache who was standing against the wall to the left of me looking at me. As I glanced over, he smiled, and I still remember vividly the stupid, creepy face that he made as he was trying to be funny. But I was 8, I wasn't a toddler. It felt weird and uncomfortable. I did my best to look away, but I could see him keep looking over to me every few seconds. I looked back at him, and once again he made another weird face that I assume he was making to try and be funny. It just came off as weird again. My mom noticed it this time and tapped me on the shoulder and whispered to ignore him. I believe she gave him a dirty look as well. The next time I looked in that direction, the man wasn't there anymore. He had walked somewhere else. The next thing I remember from that Mass was going up for communion, and then as I got back to my seat, the man was back in that spot again, and he was staring at me, just smiling the whole time until I got back to my seat. My mom noticed it again, and since we got the communion, we just left. My mom said on the way out she didn't like the way that guy was looking at us, specifically me. Now fast forward to when scouts come into play. Towards the end of our meetings, we'd sometimes have little fun contests or games, and this day in question we were having a scavenger hunt. The items we were supposed to be finding all tied into the theme of scouting. I remember some of the objects on the list being a first aid kit, a rope, a flashlight, things of that nature. We were split into 2 teams, and we all had a copy of the list, and the team to find the most items would win. So we all split up. The play area ranged from the gym to the cafeteria to some of the adjacent rooms. I was running around rooms and tiny hallways I'd never even seen before, looking for any of the items I could find on the list. I wasn't having much luck. Eventually, I found myself in this very narrow hallway in the back section of the cafeteria by the kitchen. In this hallway was one of those ice cream fridges filled with like ice pops. I looked inside the fridge for any of the items, nothing. But then I decided to be sneaky and take one of the ice cream pops. As I did, I heard a man's voice to the right of me. I looked over and saw that man from the church a few days earlier, walking over to me smiling. He said something like, "Don't let them see you taking that." He shut the fridge door and grabbed my hand and told me he had some better treats in the back where the kids aren't allowed. I broke my hand free from his grip and tried to walk away scared, and he grabbed my wrist this time tightly. I turned to him and he went, "Shh, calm down." I yelled help, and he let go of me and said, "Stop it." I ran back to the gym and told the Cub Master what happened. Thankfully, my Cub Master was an actually nice, caring man, probably because he was a father himself, and he told my mom about it. I told my mom it was that same man from the church, and my Cub Master would help my mom in reporting that man to the church. It turned out that that man worked for the church. I'm not sure what exactly he did, but he lived on the church grounds, which explained why he was there. What makes me sick, though, is that allegations came out against that man from an altar boy's parents, claiming he touched him inappropriately. The disgusting thing is, I can imagine what he was planning on attempting to do if I actually followed him to wherever he was trying to take me. I don't know if that man went to prison or what, but I know the church cut ties with him after this. I'm a cemetery operations coordinator, or you can just call me a cemetery manager. Part of my job is sitting down with guests and family members of the deceased to set up funerals, facilitate the sales of plots, etc. A 30-something-year-old man named Antonio, very spiritual man, once sat down with me to purchase a plot for his sick father who was in hospice care. Antonio was a Hispanic man with a very thick accent, and I saw in his eyes he was a very caring man. He showed me pictures of his father, who also looked like a very sweet man, much too young to be taken away from his family. But unfortunately, the man's time came that same week, and Antonio arranged for his father's funeral service at the cemetery. It was a very stormy day, the day of the funeral, which is thought to be a sign of good luck. The funeral procession stopped in front of the front office building briefly. I stepped outside under the front awning of the building and saw Antonio in the car behind the hearse. We waved at each other. Due to the weather, I went back inside until the procession was ready to proceed to the burial site. I got in one of the cemetery pickup trucks and followed the procession to the final stop, where I would stand with my umbrella supervising, as part of my job is making sure funeral services go smoothly. After the funeral, I did some laps around the place in the truck just to survey the area, as I did at least a couple times a day. I had a lot of paperwork to take care of, and on top of this, I had to close the cemetery that night, so a little later I went back to my desk and took care of this. The cemetery closes at 5:30, so as soon as it started to get dark, I drove around the place one more time to ensure all visitors had left, then drove over to the front gate to shut it. It was a relatively warm early March. The days were still on the shorter side, so by closing time on a normal day, it would already be getting darker. But on this stormy-ass day, it already felt like it was nighttime. I was driving back to my office when I thought I saw someone hurriedly walking down one of the lanes of tombstones before turning behind a hedge and disappearing out of sight. I beeped my horn so as to let them know the place was closed, but strangely enough, I didn't see them again. I grabbed my umbrella and ran out into the rain in that direction. I turned beyond the hedge he turned at and looked down this long row of tombstones on one side and hedges on the other. I didn't see anyone. I looked around in the rain for a solid 20 minutes, but eventually I had to give up. I drove back up to the office and browsed through the CCTV footage. None of it picked up on any unusual movement, even though it was a bit harder to see much because of the storm and it was also pitch black outside now. I tried to multitask, keeping an eye on the camera while finishing up some of my paperwork, when I heard the front door to the visitation room slam shut. I sprang up from my chair and yelled, "Hello?" My first thought was that it was the same person I saw before. Maybe they got locked in the cemetery and were looking for assistance in leaving. I stepped out into the lobby, but no one was there. I looked around and again said, "Hello?" Maybe the door slamming shut was them leaving. I started looking out all the windows, and I stopped when at one of them, I saw someone on the other side, looking back at me, with a blank expression. I jumped back and screamed, and they didn't flinch. I stepped closer and made a squinty-eyed, confused look when I realized I recognized this Hispanic, older-looking man. In my head, it reminded me exactly of the pictures of Antonio's father he showed me. With my heart in my throat, I ran out the front door of the building and to the side where I saw the man, but he was gone. He wasn't booking it into the fields, he wasn't hiding in a bush nearby, he was gone. I looked around me as I stood in the rain getting soaked, then ran back inside, packed up my things, locked up, and got in my car. I opened and closed the gate, once more locking it behind me, and drove home. When my wife asked me at home why I was being so quiet, I just told her, long day at work. To this day, I think I was just overworking myself, and my mind was playing tricks on me, but it still is genuinely disturbing to think about. My name is Jeremy. This was in the dead of October, chilly and windy. I live in a somewhat big town. It's very poor and old, early 18th century type buildings. A friend and I were bored one night and decided to go fuck around at 3 a.m. I know that going out at 3 a.m. in a poor town isn't exactly smart, but we like to have our fun. We got bored of driving around blasting our music. We're both very big metalheads, and at that point we had our own band. So we decided it would be interesting and cool to walk around a cemetery in the town. Behind the old town square, there's a massive cemetery. It's divided by two sides of a highway, both sides taking up about 20 acres of land. As I said, it's massive. We decided to check out the older part of the cemetery. This part is completely separated from the rest of the newer cemetery with an old iron fence and gate. We get to walking around and checking out the cemetery, trying to read the old moss-covered graves, taking pictures, being a little bit disrespectful, I know. But these were graves from at least a century ago, so there was no one living that would be upset by it, and I'm sure the people in the graves didn't mind too much. After about an hour of checking it out, we sit down next to a giant pecan tree in the middle of the old cemetery. That's when we hear this little girl laughing. It was really close to us. At first I assumed maybe it was a toy left on a child's grave or something like that. I'm not one to scare easily, so I just figured it's motion activated or something like that. We are not at all easy to scare, so we both sort of laugh, pointing out that it's creepy and just keep talking and enjoying the ambiance. Then, as in all stories like this, I get the feeling of something or someone watching me. Once again, I just figured that I was letting the entire thing get into my head. Then my friend says he thinks he sees someone in the shadows of a small wooded area right next to the cemetery, of which we were really close. At this point, we're both a little creeped out and decide to get up and leave. And that noise, the exact same noise, played again, and we hear leaves crunching underneath the feet of someone. That's when we booked it. We ran down the hill leading to the old part of the cemetery, down where my car was parked. I've never ran that fast in my life. It sounded like that laughing noise was following us at that point. We both sort of just went into full fight or flight mode at that point, going as fast as we could without thinking. The noises behind us stopped as we got to my car. I started my car and put it in drive, pulling out into the highway without looking. Luckily no one hit us. We get down the road to the only gas station that's open at this time of night to check in the back of my car. We had both been discussing how we were scared some shit had been done to it. We get around to check and immediately find the back door is open. I know for a fact neither of us ever opened it. There was no reason for us to open it. I look in the back seats, make sure nothing's there, get right back in the car and peel out. I'm still confused about what happened that night. I'm not sure if we both overreacted or what. All I know is that I still feel that weird feeling that something is behind you whenever I tell this story. When I was 19, my friend Sean, who was a big goofball, came over to chill in our basement as he often would during the summer. I remember he had a Coke bottle in his hand and I was eating Wendy's when he said we should check out that creepy little cemetery across town. It was the most random idea ever, and I even told him that. Still, we had no school the next day, and I knew exactly which cemetery he was talking about. I don't know if one should even call it a regular cemetery. It's just a small plot of land with maybe 100 tombstones at most. The tombstone's very archaic looking, and any time we'd pass, there would be no signs of anyone having come to visit within the last decade. The site probably dated back centuries, and it had this super creepy vibe to it because it was closed off by a gothic metal fence, and it was surrounded by woods on two sides, the road on one, and some old abandoned building on the other. Everything about it just gave scary vibes. It took a little persuading, but Sean managed to get me to want to check it out too. Ironically, it was a very cloudy, wettish kind of day, I guess conveniently adding to the mood. Sean pulled up his Honda to the side of the road. I told him to pull up more so it wasn't obvious. This was a low traffic road, so it would look kind of suspicious. He pulled up a few hundred feet down the road, and we got out and cut through the woods so that any potential passing traffic wouldn't see us entering the little cemetery. Hopping the fence in the woods was easy. It was maybe a 3 or 4 foot fence. Sean kind of took the lead on this since it was mainly his venture. He led us through the eerie little plot of land, and we looked at the archaic tombstones. They all seemed to be from the 19th century. The writing on some of them was illegible at that point. I know it sounds super dumb and cliche, but I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched constantly. I started looking around the surrounding woods. I told Sean how creepy this was. "I know," he replied. Still, with the feeling of being watched, I looked at the abandoned building next to the cemetery, at one of the windows. For a brief moment, I knew I saw someone standing at the window, even through the fog, smudge, and dirt on the glass, but they casually either ducked or walked away from the window. I told Sean we were being watched by someone in that building, and he turned to look at it as well. Then he went to look for the entrance to it. I told him don't. I said we should just leave before we get in trouble. I stayed still by the tombstone he was looking at while he walked around the building, and then he found a way in. He called me over, but I stayed put. Then I heard some loud kind of crack, so I looked in that direction, and there was this older man, probably around 55. Gray hair, had on a black raincoat, I believe he was wearing jeans, and he had a mustache, but that's all I really got of him. Then he opened his mouth and screamed, not just yelled, he screamed, "Get out." He screamed it so loud I thought I saw birds fly away from being startled. And just like that, I started to feel lightheaded, and suddenly everything went dark. The next thing I remember was waking up to being dragged in the woods. I freaked out, thinking I was being kidnapped. But when I turned and got up, I saw it was just Sean. Sean was freaking out about something. He told me to follow him and run back to the car, so I didn't ask questions. As we ran through the woods, I heard something close behind me, and when I turned, I realized we were being followed by someone, so I ran even faster. We got to his Honda, and he basically put it in drive before the car even had a chance to fully start. When Sean was inside that abandoned building, he found a sigil of Baphomet painted on the wood floor, which is basically the sign of Satan. Around it were a bunch of freaky dolls with buttons for eyes. He didn't get to see anything else in the building, because he heard the old man scream at me outside. He came running to find me passed out on the floor, and he saw the old man slowly walking over to me. He started to drag me away from the old man and into the woods. He actually literally picked me up and threw me over the fence to get me out. I quickly came back to consciousness, and that's when we ran. I had only fainted one time in my life, and it was at that moment. I don't know why I fainted, but it happening at a graveyard with some kind of satanic ritual building right next to it makes it that much stranger. My grandpa passed away a few years ago. I was always very close with him. This past July, on his birthday, I paid him a visit at the cemetery. The cemetery he and my grandma chose to be buried at was about an hour drive from my apartment. My family lived closer, so they all went to his grave together. I had to go separately. It was a rainy, depressing day, and there's nothing worse than visiting a cemetery on a gloomy day. The gatekeeper of the gate asked for the plot number. I gave it to him and he let me in. It's a pretty big cemetery, and I'd only been there a couple other times. Not as the driver though, so I had a hard time finding it. I didn't see many other people, if any, at the cemetery that day. I'm sure the weather had something to do with it. Eventually I found his stone and parked my car in the grass to the side. I put some flowers down under his stone, stood there for a while with my eyes closed, and prayed. When I finished my prayer, I opened my eyes and looked up. There was an old man standing about 5 rows of graves down, but directly across from me, and he was looking right at me. I knew this man though. It was my grandfather. But no, it couldn't be. I rubbed my eyes and he was gone. Did I just have a spiritual moment? Or were my eyes and mind playing tricks on me? Either way, I got the chills and I had goosebumps. I was quite honestly freaked out. I got back in my car, said, "Love you, Grandpa," and drove off. I felt like I had a headache on my way home. Not sure why. I was the only car on Prospect Road, a quiet road with dense forest on either side. Commonly, there would be deer crossing here. As my car zipped down the road, I spotted someone on the side of the road coming up, which was odd. There were no sidewalks or a walking path on this road. I slowed down, and it couldn't be. It looked like my grandpa again. When I realized this, my heart dropped 1,000 feet, and I swerved the car accidentally. I desperately tried to regain control and come to a stop. Luckily, my car didn't end up in a tree, rather just skidded out in the middle of the road until coming to a halt. I immediately looked back to where I saw him, and I saw a deer on the side of the road, looking at my car. My heart was literally racing. I was terrified. I was not well, and I needed to get home. I made made sure no cars were coming, and got back in my lane. I focused on the road as best I could given what I had just seen twice. I felt weird the rest of the day. Not sick, but something wasn't right with my head. I went to bed early after watching an episode of my show. I woke up at like 2 in the morning to my phone ringing. It was an unknown number. My heart started racing again. Any call at this hour couldn't be good news. I accepted the call and put the phone up to my ear. There was static on the other end. Finally, I said, "Hello?" More static. But what I thought I heard next, I couldn't believe. Just briefly, for maybe half a second, I thought I heard my grandpa's voice over the static. I tried to say hello again, but I was too shook. Every part of my body was actually shaking. Then the call cut to silence and ended. I called my phone provider the next day to trace the number. They couldn't. They didn't have enough data to trace it apparently, though I don't know if that was just bullshit or not. The events that took place that day and night were the scariest I've ever experienced. Do I think my dead grandpa was trying to contact me? I don't know, because that sounds ridiculous. You'd think if you experienced something like this, you'd be so full of emotion and joy. But no, it still terrifies me, and I really still don't know what to think or how to feel about it. Whether it sounds ridiculous or not, this happened, and I wonder almost every other night, was that really my grandpa on the phone? My friends and I were very stupid when we were teenagers. I was like 17 or 18 when this happened. It was the month of October, and I wanted to do something scary in the spirit of Halloween. There's a small cemetery about 10 minutes from where I live, and when I was drunk with a couple friends, I said we should sneak into it. I'll make up some names for my friends, Ryan and Mike. We were at Ryan's house. He didn't drink ever. So when I came up with the idea, he was the one to drive us to the cemetery. Mike and I were really the ones leading this. Ryan was just along for the ride. But then again, he hadn't been drinking. Ryan parked in some parking lot across the street. It was a ghost town because it was past midnight at that point. We made sure no one was around to see us as we hopped the fence into the cemetery. It wasn't exactly pitch black out, but it was slightly hard to see more than 10 feet in front of us. So we were all using our iPhone flashlights. There didn't appear to be any night security in the cemetery, so we kind of dispersed from each other. Ryan seemed to be following Mike more closely. I could still see where they were because of their flashlights. I went off a little further on my own, and I decided I'd start taking a creepy video. So I started recording with the lights still on, of course. I recorded a bunch of old headstones and the general eerie vibe of the cemetery at night. I didn't see Mike and Ryan anymore, so I started to go look for them, still recording. I looked at my phone screen and froze. There was a woman, dressed in a white gown or dress I want to say, with long, gray-looking hair. She was looking down at the ground. I looked up from my phone screen to look at her in person, but she was gone. I started to back away. I looked back at my phone screen, and there she was again. Only now she was looking into the camera, or rather looking at me. I looked up from the phone again and could not see her once more, so I looked back down at the screen again, and there I could see her moving closer to me. I started to scream for Mike and Ryan as I sprinted away from that spot. I couldn't see their lights anywhere, and they weren't answering my screams. I had a feeling they were going to try to scare me, so I ran back for the fence of the cemetery to hop it and get out. I made it to Ryan's car and texted the two of them saying they need to get out of the cemetery now. They met me at the car minutes later. We all sat in the car and I showed them the video I took. They had the same horrified looks on their faces I did. Now that I was actually watching the whole video, I could see the moment the woman slowly lifted her head from looking at the ground to looking at me, and then she starts to move towards me. We could only see her moving for like a second or two before I start screaming in the video and running away. But the way she was moving, we could see no leg movement. It almost seemed as though she were floating to me. I have that video saved on my old iPhone 4S, but the stupid thing won't turn on. It gets stuck at the Apple logo. I don't want to reset that phone until I can get that video off of it somehow. My friends firmly believe the woman in the video was a real, living person who also happened to be in the cemetery that night. But me, having been the one to actually find her, and only being able to see her on my phone screen, well, let's just say I was never a believer in the paranormal until that night.
Breakups are tough, even when you know they're for the best. I'd been trying to keep myself together after splitting up with my boyfriend of 2.5 years. I don't really want to get into it. It wasn't messy or dramatic. We just weren't right for each other anymore, but that didn't make it any easier. Some days, it felt like everything reminded me of him. I'd been forcing myself to stick to no contact, telling myself that it was the healthiest way for both of us to move on. It was hard though, really hard. One of the things I missed most about us was playing pool together. It was our thing. I'm a pretty decent player, definitely better than average, but my ex, he was incredible on his good days. He could pull off trick shots like it was nothing. 1-rail, 2-rail banks, kicks, combinations. I'm pretty sure he was even learning a standard mass. We each had pool tables at home, but obviously we're young, and staying inside every night wasn't exactly ideal. When we did go out, we always made sure that wherever we were going, usually a bar, had some pool tables. We hated crowded bars with long waits for tables and screaming patrons though, so the places we went were quieter, usually attracting an older crowd. Dive bars with old, scuffed tables and sticky floors were our sweet spot. Obviously, you can't expect to find a regulation table in pristine condition at any bar, but the dive bars were definitely a better shout than rowdy college bars. We were usually the youngest people there, but we didn't care. At that point in our relationship, we had grown somewhat bored of the typical college, let's get plastered every night mentality. Plus, even though I'm kind of shy, my ex was pretty charismatic and would get along with anyone. Us not being total newbies at pool didn't hurt either. A few weeks ago, I found myself missing that part of my life more than usual. It was a random Wednesday though, so none of my friends were free. I didn't want to sit around the house feeling sorry for myself anymore, so I decided to head out to one of the bars we used to go to. I told myself it wasn't about nostalgia, that I just needed to get out. Believe me, I'm not the type of person, nor do I usually have the confidence to go out myself, but I was feeling some type of way that night. The bar was exactly the same as I remembered. Dim lighting, worn out stools, a jukebox in the corner. The familiarity was comforting, but it also stung. The memories came flooding back, and I almost turned around and left right then, but I forced myself to stay. After grabbing a few drinks, I wandered over to one of the pool tables and started idly chalking a cue. I'm not really sure what I was planning on doing there. Playing alone would have been a little odd. Luckily, my question was answered because a guy walked over. He was maybe in his mid-20s, the only person in the room even close to my age. He leaned against the table and asked if I was up for a game. I nodded and told him to rack him up. He put some money in the slot and started racking the balls. I laughed to myself as he racked them wrong, but I didn't say anything. We played a few rounds, and I started to relax. He wasn't bad, not as good as my ex, but not terrible. I wasn't going easy on him though. I won every rack we played. We chatted as we played, and he even bought me a couple of drinks. He was friendly enough, but it quickly became clear he wasn't the brightest guy in the world. I like sharp and quick-witted guys who can hold their own in a conversation. This guy, not so much. Still, I didn't mind. It felt good to just play and talk and not overthink things for once. I was having a good time. After the 4th game, he popped the question, asking if I wanted to go back to his place. The question caught me off guard, but I guess I couldn't have been too shocked. I froze for a second before shaking my head. I tried to make it playful, saying he'd need a second date for that. In all honesty, I just didn't want to move so quickly. I guess I wouldn't have been totally opposed to taking things further with him, but a random Wednesday night wasn't the time for that. I guess I didn't do a good job turning him down though, because his entire demeanor changed. His smile dropped, and he literally started scowling at me. I was not prepared for what happened next. He said, "Are you serious?" and grabbed my wrist, saying something about spending all that money on those drinks. Before I could respond, he snatched my purse too. I had never been in a situation like that, so instead of screaming or fighting, I just kind of froze up. Even though we were in a public place, I was still terrified. Luckily, a couple of older guys at the bar noticed what was happening and stepped in. I'm honestly not sure what I would have done had they not. One of them told the guy to let me go. The guy glared at me, muttered something under his breath, and threw my purse back onto the table before storming right out of the bar. My heart was still racing, and I thanked those guys profusely for helping me out. That was it for me though. I called an Uber and left the bar, still kind of shocked and trying to process what had just happened. I decided to close my eyes in the Uber. I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I remember is the Uber driver gently waking me up. We were parked across the street from my house. I thanked him, got out of the car, and started walking toward the door. As I rummaged through my bag for my keys, I impulsively checked my phone for the first time since leaving the bar. That's when I saw it. That god-awful notification, AirTag found moving with you. I nearly dropped my phone. My hands started to shake as I rummaged through my purse, tossing aside my wallet and makeup until my fingers brushed against something unfamiliar. I pulled it out and stared in disbelief. There was literally an AirTag in my bag. A wave of panic hit me, way worse than what I was feeling earlier. I was still standing in the middle of the street, so I threw it on the ground and stomped on it a bunch of times until I was sure it was broken. I fought back a scream and started breathing heavily. The cold wasn't helping. I needed to get inside. I looked around frantically, but the street was completely empty. Whoever had planted the AirTag, probably that guy from the bar, would know exactly where I was. Maybe not my exact house, but the street for sure. The houses on my street are large and spaced out, so he'd definitely be able to narrow it down. I grabbed my purse and sprinted to the back door, fumbling with the lock before finally getting inside. I slammed the door behind me and locked it, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. I was safe, but I couldn't stop shaking. I walked up to my room, wondering how I had gotten myself into this mess. Normally I'm asleep by 10 and out cold for 9 or 10 hours, but there was no way I was going to sleep that night. I looked out my bedroom window, thinking maybe the scenery would lull me to sleep or something. As I was looking out the window, kind of mindlessly, I noticed an old, beat-up Lincoln drive slowly past my house. Nothing too unusual, but it was kind of late for cars to be driving on a residential road. But then it came back from the opposite direction, and I knew something was wrong. It passed even slower the second time, like the driver was scanning the houses. I didn't want to face the reality of the situation, but when it passed a third time, I had no choice. It was the guy. It had to be. He was trying to find my house. I wanted to scream again. The next time the car passed, the driver's side window was rolled halfway down. I wanted to call the police, but I didn't want that guy to know he was in the right area. I know that doesn't make any sense, but I was so scared and couldn't think straight. The next time the car passed, the driver's hand was hanging out of the window, holding something. It looked like a knife. And then, instead of driving past, the car stopped in the middle of the road, right across from my house. I ducked down, my heart beating a million beats a minute again. I stayed there, crouched below the window, too terrified to move. By the time I looked up, the car was gone. I waited for what must have been an hour, but it didn't come back. The next morning, I told my parents everything. My dad scolded me for not calling the police, but I told him I was too scared to. He called a buddy of his, a police chief, to ask for advice. His friend said there wasn't much they could do without more evidence or the car's plate number, which I hadn't been able to see. His friend told us to call the police immediately should we ever see that car again. I didn't leave the house for days. Even now, I'm really scared that he's waiting somewhere and he's gonna see me enter or exit my house again. I haven't seen the car since though, so maybe the nightmare is over.
I don't have the most exciting life, but it's comfortable. I'm 40, single, no kids. Some people might find that depressing, but honestly, I don't mind. I've got a steady job, a decent house, and no one to answer to but myself. I work as a bartender at a high-end luxury rooftop in a neighboring town, catering to the kind of clientele who think regular bars are beneath them. I don't live anywhere near that level of luxury myself. My place is in a pretty middle-of-the-pack neighborhood, about 20 minutes away, but working there has its perks. The tips are amazing. People in that area aren't shy about throwing money around, and the rotating crowd keeps things interesting. Since the bar is upscale, we don't have the typical regulars you find in a dive. I like that. I never quite liked how close some customers would get with me, or any other bartender for that matter. Maybe that's just me though. I like to keep to myself. I should probably mention that my name's Kevin. That'll be important later. It was a Friday night, our busiest night. The place was packed as usual, with groups of friends clinking glasses, couples on date nights, and a few folks who probably wandered in just to feel important. I always like playing a mental game with my patrons. I try to figure out which ones are pretending to be something they're not. You can tell a lot about people by the way they order a drink. The ones who ask for complicated cocktails are usually trying to impress someone. The ones who order a whiskey neat, they've had a day. I had my eye on a couple at the end of the bar who were down to their last sips of wine. It's always better to offer a refill before they wave you down. I was in my groove, mixing drinks and chatting with customers, when I noticed someone walk in who definitely looked out of place. I clocked the guy immediately. He was clenching his teeth and scowling like he was furious. He had jet black hair that wasn't combed and sat like a bird's nest on his forehead. He was wearing a blank black hoodie under a faded leather jacket, which looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. There were stains all over it, but none of that was as unsettling as his face. Like I said, he just looked so angry. He made a beeline for the bar, but he didn't sit down. He just stood there, staring at me. I wondered to myself how he had gotten past the doorman in the lobby. I cleared my throat and asked if I could get him something to drink, trying to keep my tone neutral despite the weird vibe he was giving off. He didn't answer right away, which was strange. He just kept glaring at me like he was getting ready to swing. Finally, he muttered that he wanted a double shot of Jaeger. I nodded, grabbed a glass, and poured the shot. Jaeger isn't a drink we pour often here. Most of our patrons are likely to ask for something a little higher quality. But hey, if someone wants Jaeger, I'm not about to question their taste. I set the glass in front of him and moved on to serve a few other patrons. When I came back to charge him, he tossed crumpled cash onto the counter. That also threw me off. Hardly anyone pays in cash at this place. Again, though, it wasn't my place to judge. The guy didn't say anything as I rang him up, and I was ready to move on when he spoke again. I still remember his exact words. "I knew I'd find you here, Kevin." I froze. My eyes snapped to his as I scrambled to process what he just said. I put the glass in my hand down and demanded to know how he knew my name. I didn't want to make a scene, so I kept my voice low, but I hoped he got the gist of how serious I was. He didn't answer my question, just stared at me with the same angry intensity. Finally, he said, "I know what you did." Before I could ask him what he meant, he turned and walked towards the elevators. I wanted to yell something or chase after him, but I decided against it. I was on the clock. I couldn't just neglect my job. Instead, I just stood there for a moment, completely thrown off. I was honest to God confused out of my mind. I didn't recognize him in the slightest. I couldn't think of anything I had done that would warrant such a cryptic statement. I'm no saint, but I don't go around making enemies. It put me in a sour mood for the rest of the night. When my shift finally ended, I drove home, but I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened earlier. I racked my brain for literally any explanation that made sense, but couldn't think of any. By the time I ended up going to bed, I was still relatively unsettled by the whole thing. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up randomly. I wasn't really sure what woke me up, as I didn't have to go to the bathroom, and I'm usually the type of person to sleep through the night. I didn't hear or see anything, but something felt off. Without moving, I kept my eyes open, waiting for them to adjust to the darkness. After about a minute, I saw something that gave me an adrenaline rush of fear. There was a dark mass in the corner of my room, next to the door. It was just standing there, but I was 100% sure it was something that didn't belong in my room. I felt my heart start to race, but I forced myself to stay still, pretending to still be asleep. Someone was in my room. I repeated that thought to myself like 6 times before truly processing it. I knew I had to do something. I counted silently to 3, and in one quick motion, I sprung out of bed, screaming like a crazy person. I was prepared for a fight, but the figure didn't come toward me. Instead, he bolted for the door. As he moved, I heard something clatter to the floor. I chased after him through my house, but by the time I reached the front door, it was wide open, and whoever had been in my room was gone. I wanted to run out into the yard to look for him, but I was worried that I'd be walking directly into a trap. Instead, I made what I still think is the smart decision and slammed the door shut and locked it. I thought back to the clatter I had heard earlier in my room. I walked back to my bedroom, turned on the light, and froze. In the corner of the room, there was a knife, just laying there on the floor. It was one of mine, taken from the kitchen. I felt sick. Whoever I had just chased was planning to hurt me, possibly kill me. I called the police right after that, and they quickly arrived and searched both my house and my yard, but found nothing. I gave a description of the man from the bar, and the police got the video footage from my bar, but they haven't been able to find him yet because I haven't heard anything. The thing that freaks me out the most is that I know for a fact I had locked all my doors that night. I locked them every night. During their search, though, the police were never able to figure out how that man entered my house. None of the windows were broken or unlocked, and there was no sign of forced entry. To this day, I still have no idea how he got inside. I haven't seen him since, but I would be lying if I said I don't think about this encounter often. I work as a bartender at a bar and restaurant in a suburb just outside Baltimore. I'll do my best to explain the layout so the story makes sense. It's a busy place with a unique setup. There are no waiters, just bartenders like me and the cooks in the back. If you want to find food or non-alcoholic drinks, you have to order them at the bar, and when everything's ready, you grab it from the counter. I'm not sure why things are done that way, but I guess it had something to do with management being cheap and trying to avoid hiring waiters. Either way, it keeps things fast-paced, which I actually like. For whatever reason, the place is really popular, even though I personally don't think it's anything super special. The atmosphere is lively most nights, with great music, a buzzing crowd, and a standing area near the DJ booth where people gather to dance and chat. The constant flow of customers and the high-energy vibe make the job fly by. I love meeting and talking to new people, so the gig is perfect for me. I would probably lose my mind if I had to wait long periods of time between serving guests, but that's just me. I bet some people are the opposite. That particular night started off like any other. It was a weekend, so things were going to be super busy. I was ready. After a certain time, the bar started filling up with people. It looked like more of a younger college crowd that night, which meant more dancing, more spilling, and a rowdier environment in general. Oh yeah, and worse tips, which kind of sucked for me. This one group of kids just kept on ordering round after round of tequila shots faster than I could line up the salt and limes. It's always chaos when they take over the bar. One of them was so plastered he used the same pickup line on me like 3 times. I was running around doing my thing when I noticed an elderly couple walk in and sit down at the booth in the corner of the restaurant. At first glance, there was nothing strange about them. I just thought it was interesting that 2 people that age would want to come into a rowdy place like this. I didn't have too much time to think about it though, so I went back to work. Fast forward maybe 30 minutes to an hour. I was halfway through pouring a line of gin and tonics when I noticed the couple again. My hands kept working, muscle memory taking over, but my brain was stuck on them for some reason. That's when it hit me. They were just sitting there motionlessly. They hadn't ordered anything either. No food and definitely not any drinks I would have remembered. I looked a little closer and realized that they weren't even looking at each other. They were both fixated at the wall next to them. From what I could tell, it didn't look like they were talking either. It was the strangest thing. I was beyond curious, but the bar was slammed, and I had too much to do to spend time wondering about it. I figured they might be waiting for someone, or didn't realize how the place worked. Maybe they were waiting for a waiter to take their order. When I finally had a break, I decided to check on them myself. I walked over to the table and put on my most polite smile. As I approached,
Neither of them turned to face me. They were both still staring at the wall like statues. I cleared my throat and asked them if they wanted anything to eat or drink. The woman didn't even flinch. She kept staring at the wall like I hadn't spoken at all. The man turned his head slowly, like he was moving in slow motion. When his face came into view, I felt a chill run through me. His skin was pale and wrinkled, and his eyes were almost sunken into his face completely. He didn't speak, just stared at me and shook his head once, firmly but silently. Something about the way he looked at me made my stomach twist. I muttered something in response and quickly returned to the bar. I had the weirdest feeling in my gut after that. Those people looked like they didn't even belong in this century, let alone this bar. I didn't look over at that booth for a long time. Eventually, things started to die down a little, and I remembered the couple. I glanced over impulsively, and I nearly dropped the glass I was holding. Both of them were staring directly at me now. I made direct eye contact with the woman, but she never averted her gaze. I don't think I'd ever been more uncomfortable at my job than I was in that moment. I looked away and pretended to be busy, trying not to freak out completely. By the time I glanced back again, the booth was empty. I was relieved. I was just glad that they were gone, as mean as that sounds. By the end of the night, I was still thinking about the whole thing. As I wiped down the bar and closed up with my coworker Karen, I decided to ask her if she saw anything strange. She's, I guess, what you would call a vet. She's been working there for years and prides herself on noticing everything and everyone that comes through the doors. When I asked her about the couple, she gave me a confused look and said she didn't know what I was talking about. I looked at her blankly and told her I was talking about the elderly couple that was sitting in the corner booth. She shook her head and told me she didn't remember seeing anyone like that. She then jokingly asked me if I was hallucinating, which got a playful laugh out of me, but on the inside though, I was losing it. I knew what I had seen. I asked her if she was sure, and she crossed her arms before listing at least 10 random people who had ordered food that night and what they were wearing. I laughed again and complimented her memory, but like I said before, I was dying on the inside. By the time we locked up, I started doubting myself. As I walked to my car, I noticed something that made me nearly drop my keys in fear. Across the street, there were 2 dark figures standing under a lone streetlight. I knew it was them. I wanted to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. I didn't wait another second. I jumped into my car, locked the doors, and sped out of the lot without another look. The drive home was awful. I was trying not to break down the whole time. I just kept repeating, "Oh my God," over and over. I had so many questions. Had Karen somehow missed them? Were those people even real? Was I going insane? I couldn't explain it. I thought I was going crazy. I wish this story had a resolved ending, but it doesn't. I never saw those people again. I never got any kind of explanation. I don't think I ever will.
This is one of those stories from my childhood that still just gives me the chills thinking back to it even today. It was October, and my family was on vacation to some family resort in Catskill, New York. It was kind of in the middle of nowhere, but there were a decent amount of other families at the resort. There were a lot of kids. I remember the resort being surrounded by forest in all directions, but the actual resort grounds were fairly large. I was 8 years old. I was an awkward, shy kid for most of my childhood. I would follow the lead of my older brothers usually whenever in social settings. I'm the 3rd child of 4. I have 3 brothers. During this vacation, my older brothers Eric and Josh were mostly hanging out amongst themselves since they're closer in age than I am with them. My little brother Craig was only 4, so he was constantly with my parents. When we weren't all together doing resort activities, everyone for the most part split up. My dad gave all of us money to play games at the arcade inside the activity hall building. My parents assumed I was with my older brothers at one point, but I was actually alone just exploring the resort grounds. I walked around the big cement pathway that looped around the entire resort. I passed by some families playing bocce ball, croquet, and other sports. I was partially looking for my brothers or just anything I could do by myself. I started exploring the inside of the activity hall building, and I found the arcade my dad was telling us about. It was actually a pretty impressively sized arcade. It had a bunch of pinball machines and all the standard classic arcade machines. At the time, most of the games were just a quarter to play. So I looked around the room for a game I wanted to play, and I noticed in one corner of the room this door with this really fogged up looking square glass window in the middle. It was like a special kind of glass that was hard to see through. I thought I could see something through the glass, so I walked a little closer to the door to look through it better, and I saw this humanoid figure standing there, staring through the window. I looked at it for like 15 seconds and it wouldn't move. I could barely see the face of it through the weird glass, but it kind of looked like a Halloween prop. It was Halloween season after all, and so that's what I assumed it was, a decoration meant to scare the kids. I walked away to find a game and ended up playing the Simpsons arcade game. The arcade machine was in the line of sight of that door though, and I couldn't help but keep looking over to it every few seconds, still seeing that blurred image of the figure on the other side of the door. If it was a decoration, it was doing its job and creeping me out. After I lost the game, I just had to go back over to the door and look through the glass again, this time putting my face basically right up to the glass. I saw the blurred face of the figure standing there. It was a man for sure. The neutral expression on the face suddenly changed to a smile, and I gasped in horror. It was a real person. I ran halfway out of the arcade, then stopped and turned around. The blurred figure on the other side of the door was gone. I slowly walked back to the door and opened it. I was brought into this dark hallway. It just had this liminal, unexplainable feeling inside of it, and I was creeped out. I didn't see anyone in there, but it got so dark mere feet away from the door that for all I knew, there could have been someone hiding further down the hall. I went back through the arcade to where I came in from, and went straight back to our room and stayed there till my parents returned. I told them about it, and I'm sure they found it odd. That night, when we all had dinner together in the dining hall, something disturbing happened. I noticed a man sitting alone at one of the nearby tables. He was facing me and looking at me. He had a plate of food in front of him, but I don't remember seeing him eating. When he saw me look back at him, he smiled. Immediately, I thought back to the man I saw on the other side of the door. Even through that blurry glass, I felt like the face and smile matched. I quietly told my parents about the man, scared, and they looked back at the man, which caused him to stop looking over. My dad told me to just not look in that man's direction. Pretty soon the man got up and left, and he took one last look at me before he did. I tried my best to look away and pretend not to notice. That was the last time I saw that man on our trip. I look back on it and feel like he was most likely a predator. The way he just stood there still as a statue, watching me for so long. And then that creepy smile. If I'm right, I hope no children ever fell victim to him. I once dealt with a very bad stalker situation as a male when I was 23. I had met this girl Alyssa who was 19. I actually slid in her DMs on Instagram and it went from there. I was surprised she answered me because she had a lot of followers. We hung out only a few times, but she seemed extremely clingy very quickly, which was a major turnoff for me. I started hanging out with other girls, and as I would get new followers, Alyssa actually texted me angrily about it, as if we were dating. She got mad at me for allegedly ignoring her texts, yet my follower count was going up from new girls. It was pretty comical at first. I didn't really let it bother me. I started talking to this girl Meg. As our second date, we decided to go to Dave & Buster's. We drank a little before we went, so when we got there, we already kind of had a buzz going. We were playing the Basketball Connect 4 game. That's when my phone kept going off in my pocket. After the timer on the game ended, I checked my phone, and I got 3 texts from a random number and a picture. The picture was of Meg and I in front of the basketball game. The text said, "No way, I'm at Dave & Buster's too." When I went to text back, I saw the text didn't come from another iPhone, so it most likely meant it was sent from some kind of burner number app. I looked in the direction from where the picture was taken. My first assumption was that it was going to be Alyssa, but she wasn't there. It was just a few other groups of people playing different games. I replied, "Who is this?" but there was no response. I showed Meg the text and picture, and she agreed it had to be a friend messing with me. We went across the place to a different game, and it happened again, a few minutes into playing this new game. I got a picture texted to me with both of our backs turned to the person taking the picture, and they were maybe like 50 feet away from us when it was taken. It looked blurry though, like it was zoomed in. This time they sent a text saying, "My favorite game, can you beat my high score, LOL." I told Meg to wait there as I walked to the area where the picture was taken from. I looked all around the immediate area, expecting to see Alyssa or honestly anyone I knew, but it was just a bunch of strangers. Some random lone guy playing some ticket jackpot game, this group of teenagers playing skee-ball. It was a normal scene. I replied to the text again asking, "Who is this?" Then I texted a few of my close friends a screenshot of the pictures, of course asking if it were any of them first. I believed them when they said it wasn't. It could have been anyone, but I did not see Alyssa in there. The person responded to my text, "Who do you think it is?" I said maybe we should go to Meg, and she agreed. We left the building and went to my car. I got a text from the number saying, "Why'd you leave?" I didn't respond. We went to a nearby bar to continue our date, and after that, Meg actually came home with me. Meg and I were in my room when I got a text again. It was from the same number, another text and picture. The text said, "What a lovely house, come outside," and the picture was of my house. Now this was a direct threat. This was not a joke anymore. I wasn't sure if whoever it was still outside my house or not, until I heard a window break from downstairs. I grabbed my Glock 19 from my nightstand and charged downstairs and out the front door. I saw a big guy in front of the house with a big metal baseball bat in his hand. He was acting tough until he saw my gun. Then he dropped the bat and put his hands up. I yelled to Meg inside to call 911 as I had my gun pointed at the man. I recognized him to be one of the lone men at Dave & Buster's playing some ticket jackpot game, which now that I think about it, he was probably just pretending to be playing. I asked him who he was and why he was following me. He immediately said that he was Alyssa's brother, and that basically he was trying to stick up for his sister. I yelled at him that there was nothing to stick up for, all I did was stop answering her. He claimed that Alyssa told him that I hit her, which I screamed at him that was complete bullshit. I only hung out with her a few times and lost interest. I even went as far as to call them both batshit crazy, and he responded saying please don't call the cops. But Meg did, and when they showed up, it was an easy arrest for the police. I also sent a video of the ordeal to Alyssa, which was the sweetest form of a revenge imaginable. She didn't even reply to it, but I know she saw it. Needless to say, Alyssa's psychotic brother paid for the window, and neither of them have dared to bother me again. When I was a young kid, arcades were a lot more mainstream in society. Before everyone had smartphones and crazy advanced video games at home, going to the arcade was one of the most fun things you could do as a child. There was this arcade right by my school that my friends and I would often go to after school or on the weekends. One day I went there with my friend Connor right after school. It was kind of quiet there today because it was a stormy day and most kids probably just ran home or got picked up by their parents. So besides a few other kids, we had the place to ourselves. The usual age range of the people there was like 10 to upper teens. Connor and I were playing Street Fighter together when this older guy started watching us play. Looking back now, I'd say he was around 35, which to us when we were 10 seemed super old. Connor and I looked at each other and smirked because we both noticed it and it was kind of awkward. The man started commenting on the gameplay, like cheering us on and having remarks on basically any hits we landed on each other. At first, we laughed, I guess to be polite, thinking he was trying to be funny, but at a certain point it just got weird, like he didn't know when to stop and leave. He watched us play the entire match, and had he not been there, we would have played another, but we decided to migrate to something else just to try to get away from him. As we went over to the air hockey tables, the guy was following us and started talking to us. He introduced himself, but I don't remember the name he gave. He offered to pay for our game of air hockey. We were 10 and we viewed our quarters as gold, so we accepted the guy's offer. Even at 10, we could tell he gave off some kind of antisocial tendencies. He didn't seem completely normal. Of course, he watched our game of air hockey too and kept commenting on the game as if he were a professional commentator for some sporting event. But it went from annoying to downright creepy when he started making physical contact. It started when I scored a point on Connor and the guy congratulated me and put his hand on my shoulder. The hand stayed there for a few seconds actually. Outside I was smiling, but inside I wanted to tell him to get lost. I saw it in Connor's face too. Anytime one of us scored, he would go over to us and pat us on the back or shake our shoulders. The guy was incredibly freaking weird. Because of it, we decided to cut the arcade trip short. We told the guy we were going to head home. He then replied saying we'd be crazy to walk in the rain and offered us a ride home. We didn't have cell phones back then, and as kids we were a lot more independent, so we fully well planned to run home in the rain. We thanked him, but said we live close, so we'll be alright. That was our mistake, not lying and saying we had a ride. We left outside into the rain and started to run towards my house. Connor was going to come over to hang out. As we were running home, a red car started creeping up from behind us, in a matter that they weren't even trying to hide the fact that they were following us. We looked back at it and could see the man from the arcade behind the wheel. He pulled closer and yelled out his window, telling us to get in. We ignored him and he persisted, saying we're getting soaked, get in the car. I yelled back, we're good, and we continued to run. We were getting closer to my house. The man suddenly gave the car some gas and sped ahead of us, then pulled over next to the curb where we were about to pass. Connor and I stopped, and I said, cross the street. We did, to avoid the man possibly jumping out of his car to grab us. This ordeal made us run even faster to my house. My house was now in sight, and the red car was still behind us. We made it to my front porch, and I rang the bell at least 10 times until my mom answered the door. We pointed to the red car, but it was already all the way down the street. We told her about the man who was following us from the arcade, and she was mad that we led him right back to the house instead of ringing one of the neighbors' doorbells. And she was right to say that, because the next day when I was leaving to walk to school, I saw that red car parked a few houses down on the opposite side of the street right away. I went inside to tell my parents, and while my mom called the police, my dad stepped outside and started angrily walking over to the car. As my dad was halfway towards the car, it turned on and sped down the street to never be seen by us again. I had to speak to the police a little bit to describe the man and what he did at the arcade during the walk home and afterwards. Sadly, my dad did not catch the license plate, but they did have the information on what kind of car it was. Still, I don't think they ever found that guy. He was clearly sick in the head. We were not allowed back at that arcade by our parents, and the arcade owner was alerted of that man.
Brace yourself for the literal terror I'm about to share with you. I don't even know if this is the place for a story like this, but I can't think of anywhere else to talk about it, and I just need to put it out there. I've told everyone under the sun about this. My family, my neighbors, my friends, random news outlets. It's never enough. I can't really explain it, but I feel some weird obligation to inform as many people as possible about what's been happening to me. So here goes. It's November of 2019 as I'm writing this. The story goes way back. I'm talking like 7 years plus. I can't tell you the exact year off the top of my head, but let's just say 2012. It might have been 2013, but that's my best guess. I was in my mid-20s with a stable job and girlfriend who's now my fiancée. I never went to college, so I had been in the workforce for a while, and it was unlikely that my life would ever experience any drastic change. Because of that, there was no reason for me to move far away from home, so I didn't. At that age, my girlfriend and I had just moved into my childhood home that my parents so graciously passed on to me as my first house. It's an extremely old brick house that my dad had actually inherited from his parents when he was around 40, so I'd be keeping it in the family. The house itself has seen a few rounds of renovations, but you can still tell it's old. It's the brick that gives it away. There are very few brick houses in our area, so it sticks out like a sore thumb. I kind of like that though, it feels special. Speaking of our area, we live in a very woodsy neighborhood, so the houses are spaced pretty far apart. Our house is also the last lot on our street, so instead of bordering the woods on just one side, we border it on two. The woods back there is massive, and I mean massive. As a kid, my brothers and I would often go exploring in there, but no amount of aimless wandering ever got us even close to charting the whole thing. I'm sure some people would find that intimidating, but I've always enjoyed the wilderness, so it wasn't a big deal to me. Plus, I'm a guy who likes keeping to myself, always have, so being isolated in my own little corner of the earth was appealing. Anyway, my girlfriend and I had been living there for a few months when all this started happening. It was sometime in the winter. I can't remember the exact month. All I know is that there was snow on the ground. It was sometime after 8 in the morning on a Sunday, the one day a week I got to sleep in. As I was getting in my pickup truck to treat myself to a coffee like I do every Sunday morning, I noticed something odd. In the driveway, right next to my car, there was what looked like a trail of footprints in the snow. My first thought was that my girlfriend had somehow woken up before me without me hearing her, and she came out to the driveway for whatever reason. But the more I looked around, the more I realized that was impossible. The path led across my front yard and through the hole in our side yard fence, meaning the footprints had originated from somewhere in the woods. On top of that, the trail didn't lead anywhere near our house, meaning they couldn't have been created by my girlfriend. I remember standing there, confused as hell. The trail didn't lead around our house or up to any of the windows, just the driver's side door of my car. That meant someone had walked directly from the woods to my car, only to immediately turn around and walk straight back into the woods. It was bizarre. I ended up asking my girlfriend about it later that day, but she obviously wasn't responsible for it. I wish I could give you more details about that first instance, but it was so long ago that that's about as much as I remember. It must have been at least 2 winters after that when the next thing happened. I specifically remember it being 2015, because that was the year my Seahawks lost the Super Bowl to Tom Brady. I woke up that morning and walked to my car. I think it was a weekday, but I'm not positive. As soon as I stepped outside, I instantly knew something was very, very wrong. There were footprints everywhere. I'm talking in the driveway, near all the windows, around the perimeter of the house. The yard was completely covered in them. I'm a pretty level-headed guy, so I'm not going to say I started panicking, but I'd be lying if I said I was completely calm in that moment. I was already late for work, so I didn't have time to inspect the prints very closely, but I didn't want to leave my girlfriend in a potentially dangerous situation. I quickly ran around the house and yard to make sure no one was lurking on the property, but that was about all I could do in the limited time I had. As I was pulling out of the driveway, I texted my girlfriend about the situation so she wouldn't freak out. I ended up leaving work early that day, mostly because the situation was stuck on my mind. By the time I got home, my girlfriend had made some shocking discoveries. As soon as I pulled up, she beckoned me into the yard and pointed at one of the trails, saying it had been bothering her all day. At first, I was confused, but then I realized what she was talking about. None of the footprints had left any shoe marks. I felt like an idiot for not picking up on it sooner. Whoever had left the footprints had been walking around in their bare feet. I was at a loss for words. Who the hell would walk around barefoot in freezing cold temperatures? My girlfriend suggested that maybe it was some kind of animal, but the prints genuinely looked like 2 human feet. We went inside and called my dad, but he said he'd never experienced anything like that in all of his years of living in that house. He told me to grab my rifle and try tracking down whoever had left the footprints. I really didn't want to, but I knew this kind of thing was my responsibility. My girlfriend wanted to call the police, but I knew that would be a waste of time. We had no evidence that a crime was committed, and I didn't think trespassing would warrant a search. I told her I'd call the police if I found something in the woods, and she agreed. Like I said before, that woods is its own world, so I told myself I'd turn back as soon as the sun started going down. I slung my rifle over my shoulder and headed out. I must have been following the trail for like 30 minutes when I noticed something really strange. Seemingly out of nowhere, the trail split into 2 diverging paths. I didn't know which one to follow. Hell, I didn't even know that was possible. I thought maybe whoever had left the trail had doubled back to confuse me, but then a scarier thought hit me. Was there more than one person out there? I was under the impression that I had been tracking one person this whole time. The possibility of multiple people had never even occurred to me. That was enough to shake me up, though. I wasn't fully comfortable knowing I could be outnumbered out there. I stood there a little while longer before deciding to turn around. It was getting dark anyway. As I was walking back, I couldn't help but think about those footprints. I felt like I would have noticed if 2 people were trying to walk in the same footprints,
There's no way the person in the back could have done it without messing up at least once. And then I thought that maybe someone had walked backwards from deeper in the woods to make it look like there had been two people there the whole time. And then, obviously, there was the possibility that it was just one person who doubled back on himself. Maybe someone had been carrying another person on his back and just got tired. I really didn't know which explanation was the most disturbing. We did end up calling the police that night, but as I predicted, they told us there wasn't much they could do without definitive evidence of a crime. I told my girlfriend I was going into the woods again the next morning, but it snowed pretty heavily that night, so there were no prints to follow anymore. My girlfriend was obviously terrified, but there was literally nothing we could do. Luckily, that was the last thing that happened that winter. In fact, nothing happened for a few years after that. I would go as far as to say we had forgotten about the whole thing. A lot had happened since then. My girlfriend and I got engaged in that time frame, and we were focusing on other things. I wouldn't be writing this if the story ended there, though. What I'm about to tell you happened less than a year ago. It was just after the new year, so January of this year. One random morning, I woke up to footprints all over my property. Just like that, all the memories came flooding back. My fiancée actually broke down in our bedroom, asking me if we'd ever escaped this nightmare. I didn't know what to tell her. It was actually worse this time. There were footprints leading to my shed, and a bunch of tools were missing. God knows what else those people had done. I was furious. I called up my friend Theo, explained the situation, and asked him if he'd help me. He's a big wilderness guy, and a much more experienced hunter than I am, which is part of the reason I asked him for help. He agreed and drove over to my place a few hours later. My fiancée was worried sick, but I promised her that Theo and I would be able to handle ourselves. We dressed for the cold and geared up, knowing we might be out there for hours. The reason I wasn't worried about the darkness this time around was because Theo had this really expensive thermal scope for his AR-10, which would allow us to see in low visibility. I never spent that much money on hunting equipment, so I'd still be blind, but it was definitely comforting knowing at least one of us would be able to see. I won't sugarcoat it, I was pretty scared by the time we headed out. At first, Theo and I talked as we walked, but after 45 minutes, we were mostly silent. It's like the seriousness of the situation hit us both at the same time. I remember praying to God that I hadn't dragged Theo into some horrible situation. I'm not sure how long we walked after that, but eventually, the tracks once again split into two sets of footprints. We followed the one on the left for a few minutes, but at one point, the trail just stopped abruptly. We retraced our steps back to the split, and Theo made a comment about whoever left the tracks really didn't want to be followed. I didn't want to think about it, so we just kept following the footprints in silence. I'm not kidding you. There were at least 3 other dead ends that forced us to retrace our steps, wasting valuable daylight. I remember thinking how remarkable it was that someone could walk backwards so perfectly that a trail of footprints didn't look like it had been stepped on multiple times. I'm telling you, it wasn't normal. The one upside, which Theo pointed out to me, was the dead ends likely meant we were tracking just one person. Eventually, it started getting dark. We were really deep in the woods at that point. I didn't recognize my surroundings at all. The trail of footprints didn't diverge for a long time after that. Theo said whoever we were tracking had probably given up trying to make dead ends. Another 5 minutes or so passed, and the footprints started getting noticeably deeper. We were getting closer. At one point, another set of footprints appeared right alongside the original. Theo cursed and whispered that he had been wrong, and that we were probably tracking 2 people. The sun was basically all the way down now, so Theo was checking his scope every so often. The snow gave me some visibility, but I'll be honest, I probably would have turned around had it not been for Theo's scope. We were walking in complete silence. Out of nowhere, I felt Theo's arm reach against my chest, motioning me to stop. I looked at him, and he was looking straight ahead through his scope. I couldn't see what he was looking at, so I just kept looking at him. It looked like he was holding his breath. I had never seen him so still. After a good 20 seconds, he slowly made his way over to the nearest tree and crouched down. I followed suit, not even questioning why. He looked through his scope again, and I could see his hand begin to tremble slightly. Another 20 seconds of complete silence. I was dying of suspense.
so I lightly tapped his shoulder. He lowered his rifle and silently handed it to me. I looked through the scope and had to fight back a scream. There were 4 figures huddled in the snow. At first I thought they were bears, but I quickly realized they weren't. They were human beings. 2 of them were large and hunched over, and the other 2 were smaller. The smaller ones were clinging to a nearby tree, wildly jerking their heads around. They were eating something. I couldn't make out faces or details. Thermal scopes don't give you that, but I could see enough to know they were naked. It was the most terrifying thing I have ever seen with my own 2 eyes. Eventually, the larger ones picked up the smaller ones from off the tree and placed them on their shoulders. They then began walking deeper into the woods. Theo and I sat under that tree for what felt like an hour. We didn't dare move until we were positive that there was no way those things could hear us. By the time we got back to the house, hours later, I was surprised to find my fiancée was still awake. She told me she couldn't sleep knowing I was out there and asked what we found. I told her in as minimal detail as possible, but she was still horrified. We called the police that night, who told us they'd search the woods the first thing the next morning. Theo agreed to stay the night so the 2 of us could assist the police in their search. The next morning, the police searched the woods with our help, but called it off after a few hours due to the partly covered up footprints. My fiancé demanded that they keep searching, but they said they couldn't sanction a huge search over some missing tools. I don't blame them, but it didn't feel like closure. Theo and I knew what we saw. Winter is fast approaching, and both my fiancé and I are worried those people are going to come back again. We're seriously considering moving, but haven't been able to get the ball rolling on that. I don't really know what to think. Like I said earlier, I've told everyone I can about what's been happening to us. It's literally been going on for years. None of my neighbors have ever experienced anything like this, which doesn't make sense to me. I don't know why my house is getting targeted or what those people even want. Some of my friends think they're harmless, but other people tell me I'm in grave danger. I think I'm going to try and seal off my yard from the woods, but I don't know what else to do besides that. Hopefully we can move out soon. Last summer, I decided to tackle a major section of the Pacific Crest Trail. I've always loved hiking, especially solo trips. My plan was simple: park my car at the end of the section, hitch a ride to the trailhead, and hike back over the course of a little more than a week and a half. It sounded straightforward enough at the time. The first few days went smoothly, about how I expected. The trail was everything I'd hoped it would be. Endless stretches of towering trees and winding paths cutting through serene landscapes. I'm in pretty good shape, so I don't have to stop very frequently when I'm hiking. I'm obviously not going to hike in the dark though, so every night I had to pitch a tent to get some shut-eye. I've always preferred to keep a low profile, especially since solo hikers can attract attention. Because of that, I'd venture a little off the trail to set up my camp each night. I figured it was better that way, minimize the chance of a stranger stumbling across my campsite. Up until the 3rd night, everything was perfectly fine, but what I'm about to tell you is the reason why I'm taking an extended break from hiking or any kind of wilderness exploration for that matter. I woke up in the middle of the night with this odd sense that something was wrong. It was the kind of gut feeling you can't explain, but you know better than to ignore. I looked around my tent. Everything seemed normal inside, so I decided to have a look around the campsite. I drew my rifle, grabbed a flashlight, and unzipped the tent. There was no one out there, no one that I could see at least. I returned to my tent and started checking my pack. That's when I realized my wallet was gone. At first, I thought I'd just misplaced it, maybe left it outside the tent or buried it somewhere in my gear. But after tearing through everything, it was clear someone had taken it. My personal information, cash, credit cards, all of it. How is that even possible, though? Had someone broken into my tent just to steal that one thing and leave? It was unlikely, but randomly misplacing it was very uncharacteristic of me. I came to terms with the unfortunate conclusion that I had probably lost it myself. Things only got worse from there, though. Over the course of the next few days, I started to notice more things missing. Small items, seemingly random things.
One of my lighters, my Swiss Army knife, a few energy bars. I knew I wasn't just misplacing everything. Someone was stealing my belongings. Part of me didn't want to believe it, but by the fourth day, it was undeniable. I was being stalked. There wasn't any cell coverage on that part of the trail, so it wasn't like I could alert someone about my situation. I remember contemplating turning back, but I'd only be saving myself a couple of days at best. There was no way I'd be able to hike either direction without sleeping, but I didn't feel comfortable pitching a tent in those woods with someone literally stalking me. It was a lose-lose situation. I remained calm and told myself there was a reason I had brought my rifle out there. And then it dawned on me, why hadn't that person stolen my gun? It's almost as if they were deliberately messing with me. That night, I tied my tent shut from the inside, hoping that would keep them out should they return. I tried to stay up for as long as possible, but I eventually fell asleep from pure exhaustion. My plan worked though, because when I woke up the next morning, there was no sign that anyone had been in my tent. By then, the paranoia had set in fully though. The solitude was getting to my brain, and every second of hiking was agonizing. I don't have anxiety, nor have I ever had it, but let me tell you, I've never felt worse in my life than I did over the next few days. Just imagine being in my position. No options but to continue hiking despite knowing someone's lurking not far behind. The anxiety was perpetual, and I was unraveling. I can't explain why or how, but my mind started playing tricks on me. A rustling in the bushes turned out to be nothing. A shadow flickering at the edge of my vision vanished the moment I turned my head. The hallucinations got worse. I can't remember most of them specifically, but the one that sticks out the most is this. As I was walking, I felt myself step into an ankle-deep puddle of water that almost caused me to trip. I literally heard the splash and felt the cold water soaking my sock, but when I looked down, the ground was completely dry. I stood there in complete shock. It felt so real. I had no choice but to continue down the trail. As bad as the days were, the nights were always worse. I tied my tent shut and slept next to my rifle, but nothing made the anxiety go away. At one point, I had to splash cold water on my face to calm myself down. The hallucinations mostly subsided after that. I'm not sure what I would have done if they had continued. The next night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps walking around my campsite. I quietly grabbed my rifle, preparing to confront whoever was there, but my body was frozen in fear. Eventually, the footsteps faded into the woods, but there was no way in hell I was going to sleep after that. As soon as the sun came up, I packed up camp in a frenzy, my hands shaking so badly I could barely tie my gear. I couldn't stay out there another night. I was so close, probably a day and a quarter's hike away from my car, maybe less if I moved quickly. I decided that I wouldn't be stopping to sleep that night, that I'd push through the night to get off the godforsaken trail as quickly as possible. I hiked for hours, as quickly as my body would let me go. When the sun started to set, I gritted my teeth and continued instead of pulling off to pitch my tent. By the time it was pitch black out, I was so close. Probably 2 hours away at most. I kept walking, flashlight in one hand, rifle in the other. I started second-guessing my decision. I had never hiked in the darkness before, and I was not prepared for how difficult it was. That in and of itself was scary enough. I kept going, trying to keep my breathing steady. About an hour passed. I was getting closer. And then, I heard it. Somewhere behind me, I was sure I heard footsteps. I spun around and flashed my light, and to my horror, I saw something slink behind a tree. The adrenaline took over, and I aimed my rifle at the tree. I demanded that they come out in a loud voice. The figure stepped forward. It was definitely a human, but when I tell you it was the most barbaric-looking thing I'd ever seen, I'm not exaggerating. Words cannot describe what I was looking at. He was wearing nothing but a pair of my shorts, which I hadn't even realized were missing. His skin was scratched up in several different places, and his face was covered in hair. He started walking towards me, even though I had my rifle aimed at him. Before I could think, I tapped off a warning round next to him. He jumped at the sound and instantly retreated, sprinting back into the woods. I was in shock. Without wasting another second, I turned around and went as fast as I could. By the time I made it out of the woods, I locked my car doors and called the police. When they finally showed up, they told me that I shouldn't stick around. I didn't need to be told twice. I was out of there that night. The craziest part of the whole thing, in my opinion, was the hallucinations. I didn't think such vivid hallucinations were even possible. It's going to be a long time before I go hiking again, and I can confidently say that when I do, I won't be alone. I would advise anyone planning on hiking the Pacific Crest Trail to be extremely cautious and carry a firearm. This experience is something I still think about often. I apologize in advance if I mess up any details about the story I'm about to tell. This is something that my best friend told me multiple times several years ago now. It's one of those stories so unsettling you can't shake it even after hearing it more than once. My friend's dad was a logger, specifically a tree saw operator. For those who don't know, a tree saw is a massive machine capable of cutting down giant trees and slicing them to specific lengths. His job meant long, grueling hours, often alone in the deep, secluded forests of the Pacific Northwest. The way his logging crew worked, he was paid based on the number of trees he cut down rather than the hours he worked, so he would often push himself to work 16 to 20-hour days to finish jobs as quickly as possible. After he and his coworker finished their part, the rest of the crew would come in to clear the felled trees and transport them to the mill. While he spent about half of his time working alone, the other half was spent with his friend Griffin, another tree saw operator. They used radios to communicate, especially when they worked on opposite ends of the same job site. A number of years ago, my friend's dad and Griffin were assigned to a remote job site high up on a mountain. It took the company over 3 weeks just to clear a road wide enough for their trucks and equipment to make it to the site. By the time they began work, they were positioned in an extremely desolate part of the mountain. They were already 10 days in, making good progress, when they started hearing strange chatter over their radios. At first the voices were muffled, just faint, static-laden murmurs that didn't make sense. They tried switching channels, but no matter what they did, the chatter followed them. Anyone who's used a standard radio knows how strange that is. It should be impossible for anyone to follow you when you're switching channels. As they progressed farther up the mountain, the voices became more distinct. They couldn't hear full conversations, but based on what they could hear, they both agreed that the tone of the conversation fragments felt off. My friend's dad said it sounded almost casual at times, but the content was unintelligible. They also started finding strange signs that people had been there before them. Random containers, footprints in the dirt, and small makeshift campsites. Like I said before, they were in a place so remote it was practically inaccessible, so these discoveries were deeply unsettling. No one should have been up there. One day, Griffin came across a tent hidden just off a trail and called my friend's dad over. They decided to investigate. Inside, they found a single sleeping bag and a duffel bag filled with the most disturbing things imaginable. Multiple pairs of children's underwear, duct tape, rope, and crude sketches of children being molested. There were even photos of a fresh apple indicating whoever owned it had been there recently. Griffin wanted to pack up and leave immediately. My friend's dad, ever the workaholic, insisted they finish the job. They agreed to limit radio communication to emergencies only and decided to keep working. That night, they sat in the camper, unable to shake the dread that hung over them. The radio crackled to life again, and this time they could make out snippets of a conversation between two men. They were talking about mundane things, collecting water and firewood, but the realization that these men were likely connected to the tent freaked my friend's dad out. Griffin wasn't as fazed, but my friend's dad was losing it. The next night, my friend's dad decided to confront them. When he heard the men talking about gathering bush for a fire, he grabbed the radio and demanded to know who they were and what they were doing there. The radio went silent immediately, and the men didn't respond. That silence was almost more unnerving than the chatter. Griffin was upset that my friend's dad had announced their presence, and the two of them got into a brief argument before deciding they'd escalate the situation the next day. Around midnight, Griffin shook my friend's dad awake, whispering that someone was outside the camper. The first thing he noticed was the soft sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel outside. Heart pounding,
He fumbled for his gun, only to realize it wasn't loaded. He had no idea where his ammunition was. Griffin was unarmed, and the idea of calling the police was laughable given their location. They both sat frozen as they heard the camper door handle jiggle. The door creaked open, but didn't fully swing inward. Their camper was high off the ground, and there was no ladder or stool to climb up. Then came the scratching. Long, deliberate scratches along the outside of the door. 4 agonizing minutes passed. Finally, my friend's dad nodded at Griffin, signaling he was going to check it out. He moved quietly toward the door, gripping a flashlight in his shaking hand. Just as he reached the door, it burst open, and he was struck across the face with a knife. His pain was blinding. He fell out of the camper, hitting the ground hard. Before he could recover, a man was on top of him, pressing the knife against his neck. Another man appeared, kicking him repeatedly in the head. Griffin, without hesitation, leapt out of the camper and tackled the man with the knife. The second man bolted into the darkness, and the one Griffin had tackled scrambled to his feet and followed. They disappeared into the forest. Griffin helped my dad's friend back into the truck, and they drove 2 hours to the nearest hospital. It was bad. His face was a bloody mess, and there was a cut across his eye so severe it permanently damaged his vision. They reported the attack to the police, but nothing came of it. 2 weeks later, as the rest of the logging crew finished the job, one of their coworkers was found bound, gagged, raped, and murdered in a ditch. No arrests were ever made. To this day, my friend's dad struggles with PTSD. His right eye, with its disfigured pupil, constantly reminds him of that night. I'm sure he hasn't had a full night of restful sleep since. I've been terrified of deep woods for a long time now, mostly because of my friend's dad's experience. I haven't heard from my friend or his dad in years now, so I can only hope he's doing all right.
I'm a mother of 3, and so our grocery bills are quite high. My husband works at a tech company, and I currently stay at home raising the kids, who are 10, 7, and 3. I go food shopping at least twice a week, and I usually go to the King Cullen near our house, though I sometimes go to the nearby Target as well. Those are 2 of a very small list of grocery stores in our quiet town. To give as much context as possible, we're an Italian family and I'm currently 40 years old. This happened not even a year ago when I was 39. I was running behind on shopping one day, so I went much later than usual. The King Cullen by us closes at 10, and it was definitely past 9 o'clock already, so I hurried over to the store with my flyers and coupons. The kids were complaining about a lack of food in the house, so I had to get a quick grocery run in. Most days I'd have to go shopping with my 3-year-old daughter Haley. Since it was late and my husband was home from work at this time, for once I was able to go shopping alone, which I consider a luxury. I got to the King Cullen, which was pretty void of people at this hour since it would soon be closing. I grabbed a cart and quickly started doing my laps down the aisles and grabbing whatever was on my list and whatever was on sale. I was in the cereal aisle when I got a tap on my shoulder, which startled me. I turned and saw a very tan man about my height with a baseball cap on, a black goatee, and a red zipper-up hoodie and jeans on. He laughed and apologized for startling me, and said that he'd been looking everywhere for a specific bag of chips that was in my cart, and he asked where I found them. I politely told him the aisle, and he said he checked but couldn't find it. So I actually led him exactly to where I found the chips. He thanked me with his awful breath, and I smiled and was about to walk back to my cart, but then he started making pointless conversation with me about why he liked those chips so much. Something silly like the ingredients or a lack of a specific ingredient. I kept trying to make it obvious that I was inching my way back to my cart. He wouldn't get the hint though. It was when he made a weird pause and then said, "Gosh, you're pretty," that I said thank you and that I had to get back to my shopping before they close. I went to my cart, but he followed me and kept talking to me. At this point, as politely as I could, I told him I really would just like to shop in peace. He finally seemed to get the hint and walked away, but for the rest of my time in the store that night, I kept seeing that man circling the aisles, and each time he walked past the aisle I was in, he'd slow down or even stop and just look down at me. I was getting increasingly uncomfortable and hurried up my shopping. When I was finally done, I went to the checkout, and as I emptied my cart, here comes red hoodie guy with a whole 2 or 3 items, and he waits on line right behind me. He doesn't say a word anymore, but I felt his gaze even through the back of my head. When I was done checking out, I pushed my cart away, and the man called out, "Have a good night, ma'am," and I ignored it. As I was unloading my car, I noticed the red hoodie guy in the parking lot looking at me as he walked to his car. He got into a junky-looking Honda that must have been like 30 years old. He didn't turn the car on though, he just sat in it. I finally finished loading my car, so I got inside, started it, and began driving out of the parking lot. I looked in my rearview mirror a few times, and I didn't see any headlights behind me, so I felt safe to drive home. It wasn't until I pulled into the driveway and looked to my left down the street that I realized there was a car with its headlights off driving slowly down the street approaching our house. It pulled to the curb a few houses down. It looked to be that Honda from the parking lot. I went inside the house and called my husband's name. He came downstairs looking concerned, and I told him I was followed home by a creep. He hurried outside to the stoop, but by this time the car was already gone. The following weekend, late at night when we were all in bed, we heard some shuffling around outside in the side yard. I shook my husband to go check what it was, and he went to slide the window open. He saw someone right below the window trying to open the side gate to the backyard, but after hearing the window slide open, the man looked up and started to run. My husband grabbed the baseball bat from under the bed and ran outside, and when he came back a minute later, he said he saw the car speeding down the street and he tried to chase after it. He perfectly described the shitty Honda that the red hoodie guy was driving. It was undoubtedly him. We phoned the police, and given the late hour, a police officer arrived to our house in under 5 minutes. I described the man and his car the best I could, and that was that. He never returned to our house, not after seeing my angry husband chasing his car on foot with a bat. It still remains uncomfortable that a creep like that knows where I live, though. When I was in college, I worked at Walbaum's. The one I worked at was a 24-hour one, so a couple unfortunate people would always be stuck working that awful shift. I thought since I was 20 and in college that my boss would never put me on an overnight shift. But unfortunately, I guess when she asked my school schedule and I told her I was off Mondays and Wednesdays, she saw me as a perfect sucker to stick on the overnight shift occasionally moving forward. One day I saw that I was scheduled for a Tuesday night from 12 a.m. to 8 a.m. I had to triple check the schedule to make sure that that was right. I felt sick seeing that, and when I asked my supervisor why I was put on the overnight shift, he told me if I'm over 18, I don't really have a choice. I considered quitting, but I needed the job and money, so I just sucked it up and decided I'd do it this one time and then tell my boss I can't do it ever again because I have to study for school. So I arrived at the store at 12 o'clock and relieved my coworker Amanda. Half the lights in the store were out at this hour to save on electricity. There were a surprising amount of customers in the store when I got there. I guess more people than I expected would do quick midnight shopping runs. Past 1 a.m. though, the place was completely dead. Maybe 3 customers in the entire hour. As it got later in the night, there were less and less customers. It was past 2 a.m. by this point. I was as bored as humanly possible, and there hadn't been a customer in over an hour. I wondered if there were any other employees in the building. There had to be, I figured. They couldn't have a lone 20-year-old running the whole place by himself. There was some bald guy who looked like he could be a manager that kept passing by the front registers every few minutes. He had a key ring attached to his khakis with like 10 keys on it, and he was holding a small backpack-type bag in his hand. So I said, "Excuse me, are you the manager?" And he came over and asked if it was my first day on the job, to which I said it was my first night shift. He shook my hand without giving me his name, and asked me if I could go to the back warehouse of the store and organize the pallets. He said he'd watch the front. I didn't exactly know what that meant, but I'd figure it out. I walked towards the back of the store, and as I did, I saw him doing something to the entrance door of the store, like he was reaching for some switch on the side of it, as if he were locking it. I made my way into the back warehouse, where I saw a tall man who looked like he were 30, wearing a manager's vest that said Walbaum's. He saw my apron and introduced himself as Rob, the night manager. I said, "Oh, I thought the guy in the front was the night manager," and he looked puzzled and said, "Who?" When I described that man from before, he asked me to show him who I was talking about, because he was the only manager on duty. We didn't even make it out of the warehouse before all the lights in the store turned off. Rob told me to wait in the warehouse while he checks out what's going on. I watched as he walked through the warehouse doors into the darkness of the store, with the only light out there being from the lights of the dairy coolers that were still on. I sat on a box on a pallet and was on my phone trying to text any of my friends who could have been awake about what was happening when I heard a door from inside the warehouse opening. It was on the other side of the warehouse, separated by the freezer and dairy fridge. There were 2 ways in and out of the warehouse back into the store. I still sat there, now with my ears perked up, listening for any sounds, when I heard quiet, slow footsteps getting closer, followed by a voice saying, "Hey kid, you in here?" But it wasn't Rob's voice. It was that bald guy's voice. I hurried out the warehouse doors into the store, but quietly. I jogged to the front of the store looking for Rob, but I couldn't find him. I called out his name, nothing. I grabbed my jacket and tried to open the exit door, but it wouldn't open automatically. So I tried to physically open it, but it was locked. I heard footsteps approaching from behind me, and I turned and almost screamed, but I realized it was Rob the manager. He flicked some lever or something on the top right of the door and unlocked it, and he said in a panicked whisper to hurry and get outside. He followed behind me. We left the store and he got right on the phone with the police, and I heard his whole conversation. He said he believed an armed man locked himself into the wall bounce and was probably trying to rob the place. I told him to tell the police that I think he was coming to harm me in the warehouse, which he relayed to the operator. He told me I should go wait in my car or leave. I'm sure because he didn't want the store to be held liable for anything if something were to happen. I went and sat in my car and just watched for a little while, and within 10 minutes there were at least 4 police cars outside the store. They all went inside for a while, and I didn't see whatever was going on, so I left. I didn't quit after that, though. The next time I went into work, I was told all about what happened by my supervisor. The security footage showed that bald man circling the place, acting suspicious, checking if the coast were clear to do whatever he was planning to do after locking the doors. He cut the lights in the store. The cameras showed him going straight to the warehouse where he told me to go. That's the scariest part to me, because if he were armed and robbing the place, he could have been on his way to put a gun to my head or something. The camera showed him leaving through the emergency exit in the warehouse way before the police arrived. In the end, I never worked an overnight shift again after talking to my boss, and I stayed at that job for another few months. I'm not sure if that man was ever identified. I used to work as a night restock worker at a supermarket in a somewhat rural town. The store was called Great American. It was the biggest and best supermarket in the area. My shift would be as soon as the store would close at 10. I'd work from 10 p.m. to 3 a.m. the latest, restocking the shelves and organizing everything before the next operating day. I of course had the keys to the store for the after hours. It would be a team of 2, myself and one other, either Terry, Carter, or Alfonso. Tonight I was supposed to be working with Terry. I arrived to the store and let myself into the back where all the inventory yet to be stocked was. I started my work using the pallet jack to bring a whole pallet of boxes out to the shopping floor. I started with the bread and nuts aisle, rotating the older loaves in the front and putting the newer loaves in the back. Halfway through, I realized I hadn't seen Terry yet. I walked to the back area of the store where the inventory was, where we'd leave our belongings. He wasn't back there yet. I left the back door cracked open with a door stopper for him when he would show up. So I went back to work for another half hour, and with still no sign of Terry, I once again went to the back of the store. He wasn't in there, but I noticed the back door was shut. I assumed that meant Terry was here somewhere. I went to open the back door, and saw the door stopper was outside, which I thought was weird that he kicked it outside instead of bringing it in. I called Terry's name and it echoed through the room. He didn't call back, so I decided to call him. He picked up, sounding like he was in bed, and I asked him if he was at work. He said he wasn't coming in tonight because he was sick. Suddenly I got the chills. I told him someone kicked the door stopper off the door, and he said it could have just come undone itself. Nobody else was scheduled to work that night. I told him feel better, and we hung up. I wasn't sure if I was convinced that the door stopper came undone itself, because I kicked it under the door pretty tightly. I did a quick look around just to make sure no one was in the back of the store, and when I didn't see anyone, I went back to work, though I felt a slight sense of unease the whole time. I was stocking the remainder of the bread when I heard a loud sound echo from across the shopping floor. Okay, now someone had to be in here. I got off my knees and went to the middle aisle that intersected all the other aisles. I looked straight down the aisle and stood there for a hot second, And all the way on the opposite side of the store in the dairy aisle, a man dressed in black walked past the middle aisle, looking down in my direction. I felt my heart drop. It felt like that scene from the movie Signs where the alien walks past the birthday party. I had to think logically that maybe this was someone else filling in for Terry's shift that our boss didn't tell me about. I started to speed walk down the center aisle and yelled "excuse me" very loudly. I looked to the left down every aisle I passed since he went towards the front of the store. In one of those aisles, he was waiting at the end of it, standing there fully facing my direction. When he saw me, he walked out of sight in the direction I was just coming from. I yelled "excuse me" again and started to run down that aisle to catch up to him. I didn't get a good look at his face yet. When I got to the front of the aisle by the cash registers, I looked down the direction he went, and I saw him all the way at the end by the bread aisle. Half his body was hidden behind the shelf. His mouth was hanging open, and he started to wave me over, but he didn't say anything. His face was freaking me out. I attempted one more time to speak to him and said, "Who are you?" And he disappeared behind the shelf. I wasn't being paid enough for this. I went outside to sit in my car and call my boss. He picked up and I told him there was some random freak roaming around the store. He told me to get him out of there if I can, or call the police to get him out. I was not going to attempt to physically remove a crazy person from the store, so I called 911. I waited in my car until a police car showed up. I greeted the officer and asked him to follow me inside. We walked around the place looking for the man, and we saw him at one of the aisles again, creepily standing there again as if playing a game. When the police officer commanded him to come here, he actually listened. He was put in handcuffs, and he was the strangest man I'd ever seen. He kept smiling and looking at me non-stop, licking his lips. He had huge bags under his eyes. The only words he spoke were when answering the police officer, saying he was looking for a snack. I didn't like the way he was looking at me as the police officer was walking him back outside to his car. It was this menacing, threatening smile that I haven't forgotten to this day. I continued my work after that. Needless to say, I never left any of the doors open again.
My family has a little vacation home in Colorado. My parents are avid skiers, which was the motivating factor behind that purchase. The home has been in the family since before I was born. It's definitely showing its age in a lot of ways, but it's also like 40 years old. It's not going to look new. My dad's had to do a lot of upkeep on the place over the years. It's still in our family today, and it's really on its way out at this point. My dad talks about knocking it down and putting up a new place, but I don't really get involved in his decision. This story takes place like 15 years ago when I was 8 and my brother was 11. We were up in Colorado during a blizzard. The snowfall was insane, and of course, my brother and I had to go out and play in it. The great thing about going up there when we were kids was the sheer amount of space. The property has a huge opening with woods surrounding in all directions. There's a dead-end road that goes downhill which leads to a few more, almost equally big properties. It's the perfect layout for hide-and-seek or snowball fights or any number of games like that. My brother Josh and I went out in our snow gear to play our snowball fight game with our own little custom rules. Basically, we'd set up 2 forts. We could pick our forts to be anywhere, but we had to tell each other where we were picking. We would then make one giant snowball as the so-called jewel that we'd have to successfully steal from the other base and bring back to ours. Josh chose to make his base on the nearest neighboring property. There was almost never a car, like 9 times out of 10 that we'd go there, so we'd often play games on their property too since they were never there. What we'd do is build little walls to emulate a fort, and then put the big snowball behind the walls. So to get to each other's bases in this game, we could either cut through the woods or take the road up or down to get to the opposite fort. Once Josh ran down the road and disappeared, I was supposed to wait for him to blow the whistle to signal that the game began. I waited for a while, like a long while, over 5 minutes. He had already set up his fort by then, so all he had to do was get back down there and blow the whistle. When it hit around maybe the 10-minute mark is when I decided I probably just couldn't hear the whistle from there, so I started plotting my route. Was it better to go through the woods or down the road?
I opted for the road because honestly, going through the woods during a blizzard at 8 years old was a scary thought. I started trudging through the unplowed snow on the ground as flakes of snow blew into my face. With the amount of layers my mom made me put on though, I wasn't cold at all. As I approached the driveway to the neighboring property, I looked through the trees and didn't see Josh over there. With all the brush and trees bare in the winter, it was quite easy to see through the woods. So I cut into the property through the trees to kind of sneak in, but Josh was literally nowhere in sight. I saw his fort, so I looked around, and when I could confirm he wasn't anywhere in sight, I approached his fort to grab the jewel. Before I could, I heard a woman's voice yelling out, "Excuse me, are you looking for your brother?" I turned in the direction it came from, and it was an older woman at the front door of the neighbor's house. I called back that we're playing a game. She responded with, "Your brother's in here." I was very confused. I started walking towards the front steps of the house, and as I got closer, the woman's face got clearer. To my 8-year-old mind, she looked a lot older than she probably was. As I got closer to the house, I noticed at one of the upstairs windows, there was someone looking out at me. For a second, I actually thought it was Josh. It was someone with half their face covered, presumably by a black beanie, and the bottom part of their face covered under the bottom of the window. I also noticed another trail of footprints leading to the front door. They had to be Josh's. The woman was giving me a very creepy smile. I remember that feeling of my heart dropping for some reason. She waved me inside to come in and get out of the cold. I stopped dead in my tracks and screamed, "Josh," but there was no response. The woman stopped smiling. She didn't expect me to do that. I also noticed that the other trail of footprints was doubled over. If it was Josh, his footprints turned around and headed back towards the woods. I then heard heavy footsteps from inside the house. They sounded like they were upstairs coming down. I started to run, and the woman screamed something at me or someone else that I didn't understand. I looked back once at the house, and that face that was upstairs at the window before was no longer there. I ran off the property back on the road, running through my previous footsteps. I started to hear my dad's whistling from up the hill, the whistling he'd do to get my brother and I home at dinner time. When I made it back to our driveway, my dad and Josh were there already, having been on their way to get me. Before I could even try to explain what just happened, Josh was already telling me that there were people in the neighbor's house telling him to come inside. I said the same exact thing happened to me, so my dad went down there with some kind of weapon in his hand while we waited in the home with our mom. He came back after a long while and said that the front door was locked and no one was answering, so we went to another neighbor's house, and they knew the owners of the house and they called them. This part still gives me chills whenever my dad mentions what he was told. The owners of that house were not there that weekend. Nobody was supposed to be in the house. The cops were called and everything, and my brother and I did have to speak to one of the officers on scene to describe the woman. After that, we were no longer involved. According to my dad, the back door was unlocked and the house was investigated, which turned up nothing. For this reason, my parents took home any extra valuable things in fear of a break-in while we were gone. After that day, we steered clear of playing on that property, just from the creepiness factor of that memory alone. Thank God we didn't go in that house. I've been skiing for as long as I've been able to walk. My parents used to ski competitively, that's actually how they met, so it was really important to them that my siblings and I learned as early as possible. Fast forward about 20 odd years, and that's how old I am now. This story happened to me a few winters ago when I was 21 years old. I was a senior in college. Everyone knows the best skiing accessible to the Northeast is Vermont. It was going to be a trip like any other. It was me, Jaden, Rylan, and Amir. I can't remember for the life of me what mountain we were skiing that trip, as Jaden had booked the whole thing and Rylan was driving. What I do remember was that it was massive, with like 7 ski lifts covering all the different peaks. If I had to guess, it was Killington. We skied nearly 2 full days, and I'm sure there were still trails we missed. That's how big it was. It was the second day. After skiing the day before, we had a pretty good grasp on the trails we enjoyed, so this day would mostly be about testing ourselves and pushing the limits, as per tradition. I'd also be lying if I said we didn't have a handful of fireball shooters to liven things up. We were having an extremely enjoyable trip. The double blacks never got boring, and racing down each slope was its own little game. We had maybe an hour left until the lifts closed. We were all exhausted, but we knew as soon as we hit the road to head home, we'd instantly miss the mountain again. We were contemplating how we would end the trip at the top of the lift when two girls without their helmets made their way over to us. Now, this might sound a little odd to some people, but I wouldn't be doing this story justice if I left out this detail. The girls, one brunette and one blonde, were drop-dead gorgeous, and I don't say that in any type of strange way. They were just objectively two of the most beautiful women I'd ever seen in person. It was disarming. They introduced themselves as Taylor and Devin, and we started making small talk. They basically told us that they were bored because the mountain was full of older folk, which was actually something I had remarked to my friends about the day before, so it made sense why they approached us. A group of young guys that seemed around their age. Devin seemed like a really seasoned skier, as she kept asking Amir all these technical questions about his skis. Him and Rylan actually own their own expensive skis as opposed to renting like Jaden and I always did, which the girls seemed to be impressed with. Taylor made a comment about our shooters, and we jokingly told them that the alcohol unlocked our true ski potential or something dumb like that, which they found funny. To our surprise, Devin pulled out an unmarked bottle and taunted us, calling us bitches for sticking to a drink as tame as Fireball. The four of us welcomed the challenge and happily swigged some of their bottle, which I could tell sent Rylan a little over the edge. He tends to drink more than he could handle, so this wasn't too surprising. I made a note not to drink too much because something about this whole situation just rubbed me the wrong way. I still had trouble believing that these two girls would want anything to do with some dumb kids like us, especially since we were all wearing helmets and our faces weren't exactly visible. Things were going really well though. Amir was being his usual overly flirtatious self, but Taylor seemed like she was into it, so I didn't complain. I figured we were just going to spend the remainder of our time on the slope with these girls, which I didn't really mind too much. Hell, maybe they knew something we could do after the slopes closed. Just then, Devin asked us if we had skied down a trail called Devil's Forest, a name which I definitely didn't recognize. Our other friend Chase would have had the trail map memorized as he's literally a walking GPS, but he wasn't with us. We told them we hadn't, and they explained that it was a glade trail that's a little obscure and rarely open. For those who don't know, glades are basically trails that extend in between trees so that you're skiing through a forest. We actually enjoyed skiing glades more than anything else, so this Devil's Forest trail piqued our interest. We told them we were game, and they motioned for us to follow them. We reached a choke point on our skis, and they told us to take them off because we had to walk slightly uphill for a short while. I could tell we were in a relatively desolate part of the mountain, as the snow was perfectly fresh and there was no one around. The thought of an adventure was kind of invigorating though, so I thought nothing of it. Drunk and curious, we clipped our skis off and followed the girls up the mountain. Amir and Rylan ran ahead, presumably to flirt some more with them, and Jaden and I hung back a little bit to give them some space. As we followed, I could tell Jaden looked a little wary, so I asked him what was on his mind. I like to think of us as the rational, level-headed ones in the group. Amir was too unpredictable and impulsive, and Rylan would follow a girl if she led him off a cliff. Jaden said that it was weird that this supposed trail would be inaccessible from a ski lift, which I agreed with. I had never had to walk uphill to reach a trail before. We agreed to just keep a keen eye on things. What could two girls do to a group of four big guys anyway? They led us into the forest, and the terrain finally started leveling out. Jaden and I caught up with the group, and it was apparent that Rylan and Amir had both made considerable progress. Rylan had his arm around Devin, who was smiling and laughing. They pointed in the same direction we had been traveling, which had all of a sudden become a downward slope. I sighed, knowing this was another instance where we could have used Chase's help. He would have known exactly where we were and where this trail would have led. Jaden was still skeptical and asked the girls if they were sure that this was a real trail. They responded yes and told us that it would also take us right back to the lifts. Before I could say anything, Devin pulled the bottle out again and told us we had to finish it. Amir and Rylan happily took some hefty swigs, but when the bottle got around to Jaden, he said he was drunk enough. As soon as he spoke, I could have sworn Devin's smile became a really angry scowl for a split second. But by the time I blinked, she was smiling again. I must have been the only one to notice because I looked around at my friends and their expressions were all normal. She put on a seductive smile and batted her eyes at Jaden, asking him nicely, He reluctantly grabbed the bottle, if just to shut her up. By the time it got to me, I put the bottle up to my mouth, but didn't actually drink. Everything about this encounter was triggering alarm bells suddenly in my head. I handed the bottle back to Devin, who put it away. I noted that neither girl drank this time around. It dawned on me that I hadn't seen either one of them drink anything this whole time. I checked my phone, half an hour until the lifts closed. I tried to come up with some excuse for why we couldn't ski this trail, saying that we wouldn't have enough time to get back up and down the mountain to where we had parked. The girls insisted that we'd have enough time and that the lifts were connected on the bottom anyway. Then, without warning, they told us that we were wasting too much time and took off toward the slope, telling us to follow them if we could. Amir and Rylan immediately followed, clearly hoping for a favorable outcome at the bottom. Jaden and I obviously didn't want to, but figured we had no choice but to follow, so that's what we did. I let Jaden lead the way, because after all, this was still a challenging looking slope, and skiing in the forest is no joke. I'm not sure what I was expecting, but when we made it to the bottom, I was relieved. The four of them were at the bottom of the slope, laughing and flirting like they had been before. Jaden and I caught up with the group, but something was wrong. There wasn't a lift in sight. We were still surrounded by forest on all sides. I sternly asked the girls where the lift was, and they told me to stop worrying and that it was close by. Then they said they'd take us there in a few minutes. I relaxed a little, assuming that I was worried this whole time about nothing. As I was rubbing my eyes, I heard a distinct thump in the snow. I opened them to see Rylan, who was literally passed out on his back in the snow. The girls laughed, calling him a lightweight, but I could tell it was more serious than that. Before I could even react, Amir slumped over too. I started freaking out, and I rushed over to them, unclipping my skis. I thanked my lucky stars that they seemed to be breathing normally, but I was beyond horrified. Jaden took a step towards the girls, asking them what the hell was going on. They seemed genuinely shocked, saying they have no idea what was wrong. Jaden took another step before he too passed out in the snow. I stared in shock, still trying to wrap my head around the gravity of the situation. I just couldn't fathom that this was happening to us. My head started spinning, and I was sure that I was next. The girls had stopped pretending by now, and they looked at me like they were waiting for me to pass out. I felt myself getting dizzy, so I sat down in the snow, even though I wanted to stay on my feet. I demanded to know what they had given us. They didn't respond or even move for that matter. I yelled at them over and over again, but they still didn't react. I wanted to get up, but I quite literally couldn't stand. I didn't pass out though. I kept my eyes open the whole time. Eventually, Taylor turned to Devin and said something along the lines of he must have not drank enough. She looked more pissed off than anything. Devin cursed before telling Taylor that they had to go. I was still frozen. After unclipping their skis, I watched them take Amir and Rylan's skis before trudging off into the woods. I had to do something, but my body still felt numb. I couldn't just let them walk off with my friend's skis. I knew they wouldn't be able to move that fast carrying 2 sets of skis each, especially through the snow. Another few minutes passed, and I started to regain control of my body. I stumbled after their tracks in the snow, but it was actually freakish how far they'd gotten, even with all that added weight. Eventually, I turned a bend and saw them in the distance, way ahead of me. I figured as long as I kept them in sight, I'd be able to track them down. I followed for a couple minutes, and that's when things got crazy. The forest gave way to a clearing, which I could see turned into a road. We must have literally been on the opposite side of the ski mountain, which made sense looking back. That's when I noticed the van parked in the distance. I stopped in my tracks at the edge of the woods. The side of the van opened, and 4 big-looking dudes stepped out to intercept the girls. The girls motioned for the guys to get back in the van, and one of them turned and pointed directly at me. That's when I realized I was in too deep, and also felt like an idiot for leaving my helpless friends unconscious in the woods. The guys from inside the van seemed to be debating whether or not they should leave or chase me, and I wasn't waiting another second. I started wobbling back the way I came, knowing I'd be able to find my friends on the account of the tracks I left behind in the snow. I found them, still passed out. I figured Jaden had had the least to drink, so I tried shaking him awake first. After a couple of handfuls of snow to the face, he was awake enough to talk. I told him what had happened, still in shock. We tried waking Amir and Rylan up, but had no luck. Jaden and I figured we had no better option than praying those guys didn't decide to track us down, but they never came. I might not be telling this story if they had. We waited about an hour for our friends to wake up, and when they finally did, we told them everything. We had a million questions. Who were those girls? Who were those other guys? What were they going to do to us? It was chilling imagining what could have happened had I not been quick enough to pretend to drink. Best case scenario was that we would have just woken up robbed, but even that would have been horrible. Something tells me that no one would go to those extremes just to rob some broke college-looking kids. Besides, who really keeps valuables on them when skiing? I guess Amir and Ryland's expensive skis were worth stealing, but it still felt like overkill. Plus, how would they have even known that we had expensive skis with us as opposed to renting? Things didn't make sense. Finding the car was hell. Reporting it to the police was hell. The drive back home was hell. The people running the mountains swore they'd identify those people, but we obviously had to get back on the road and couldn't verify that. The police took it a little more seriously and told us we'd be updated should anything come up. I think it even made local news, but it's been years now, and they obviously never found everything. To this day, we have no idea what kind of roofie they even gave us. Nothing online described anything that was so effective so quickly, especially in a moderately small amount. Our best guess was that the substance was a mix of drugs, which makes sense because all my friends were feeling kind of woozy after they woke up. Those girls and whoever else was behind the whole thing were some sick people. I can only hope it was just an elaborate robbery and nothing more sinister. This is going to sound a little weird, but bear with me. Every winter, my friends Kyle, Ricky, and I have this little tradition of walking out onto this frozen lake a few towns over. It's not some grand event or anything, we just do it for fun. There's something about the vibe of being out there on the ice, surrounded by the quiet stillness that feels almost otherworldly. It's just one of those simple things we've always enjoyed. Call us weird, but we can never get enough of the serenity. If you've ever been out in nature by yourself with the only sound being the gentle patter of snowflakes, you know what I'm talking about. It feels like you've got a piece of nature all to yourself. The photos always turn out great too, which is a huge plus for a couple of edgy guys like us. This happened this past winter. It's April as I'm writing this, so about 4 months ago now. I know what you're probably thinking, but don't worry, none of us fell through the ice. That's not what this story is about. It was snowing pretty heavily that night, which was the main reason we decided to go. It had been consistently below freezing for a couple of weeks too, so we were relatively confident the lake was completely frozen over. I'd personally take winter over summer any day of the week. I bet all my friends would agree. There are about a million reasons why, but one of them is as simple as the snowfall itself. First of all, it's just pretty. What I like most about it, though, is that you'll never find yourself in complete darkness. Even after sunset, the world isn't entirely dark. The light reflecting off the white snow blends day and night, so you're left with this really surreal feeling that doesn't arise from anything else. The moon was also pretty full that night, so that feeling was amplified. Kyle was driving that night. He had a pickup that handled pretty well in the snow, so we just played it safe and let him drive, even though Ricky was usually the one who chauffeured us around. The lake itself is surrounded by a thin forest, so we couldn't actually drive all the way to the water's edge. I don't think forest is the right word. It's really just a cluster of sparsely scattered trees, but it's more than enough to prevent a car from driving through. We parked in a nearby lot and got out of the car. It was freezing out. The three of us bundled up and walked toward the lake. I didn't smoke at the time, I still don't, but Ricky and Kyle both do, so they lit a couple of cigarettes as we walked. I think it was after midnight, but I can't say for sure. All I remember is that there wasn't a soul out there. Not an animal, not a person, nothing. No movement whatsoever besides the three of us. We reached the lake, and as we anticipated, it seemed completely frozen over. The three of us were laughing about something stupid when Kyle picked up a small boulder and chucked it onto the ice, testing its integrity. It didn't even crack, so we took that as an indication to make our way towards the middle of the lake. We obviously didn't go super far on the ice, that would have been careless, but we did venture a decent ways away from the ledge. We were maybe 100 feet out when something caught our attention. On the far side of the lake, near the edge where the trees bordered the ice, something big and dark was moving. We stopped talking immediately. We just stopped in our tracks, watching. Whatever it was large, hunched over, and moving slowly toward the lake. Finally, we realized what we were looking at. It was a bear. Ricky was the first to say something. He whispered, "Is that a bear?" as quietly as he could. I didn't answer. My heart was already racing. If it was a bear, the last thing we wanted to do was draw its attention. We stood there, frozen, not even daring to breathe too loudly. But then, as the figure moved closer, something felt off. The way it walked wasn't quite right. Too upright. Too human. It also looked like there was something dragging behind it. Nothing about it made sense. It was one of the most bizarre things I'd ever seen. And that's when it straightened up completely, and we realized the truth all at once. It wasn't a bear. It was a person. A person wearing some kind of bear suit. Kyle said, "What the hell," in a low voice, and I was thinking the same exact thing. I know it doesn't sound scary in a generic sense, but if you had been there, you would have been terrified too. I tried to respond, but the words wouldn't come. I don't know if I was more afraid or confused, but something told me to stay quiet. The figure kept moving toward the ice, dragging something behind him. At first, it was hard to tell what it was. The snow blurred the details, but as he got closer, I realized he was holding a rope that was attached to the thing he was dragging, and a few moments later, we could see it more clearly. It was a small black bag. It looked like a smaller-sized garbage bag, if they even made those. Either way, it was chilling. We stood there, unsure of what to do. My mind was screaming at me to turn around and leave, but my body felt paralyzed. I couldn't move. I don't think Ricky and Kyle were too keen on turning around and leaving either, because neither one of them flinched. I probably wouldn't have left right then, even if I hadn't been so scared. I needed to know what that person was doing. And then, as if the situation couldn't get any stranger, the man unzipped and stepped out of the bear suit. Seeing him as a person didn't make things any better. He wasn't particularly large or intimidating, but there was something unsettling about him. We watched as he bent down, presumably to pick up a rock, but I couldn't tell from so far away. And then the sounds started. He knelt down holding what looked like a rock and began repeatedly slamming it into the ice. It might have been placebo, but I swear I could feel the vibration in the ice even from the distance. He was trying to break through, most likely to dispose of whatever was in that bag. Ricky tapped my shoulder, and I turned to see him and Kyle moving back towards solid ground. Without a word, I followed suit, and the three of us tried to move quickly without making too much noise. Every step felt deafening in the quiet, even though I knew there was no way that guy could hear the crunch of snow from that far away. We barely made it a few yards when a voice yelled out, "Hey," from behind us. I didn't even look back. I just started running, praying that guy didn't have a gun. The cold didn't help. I found myself starting to get winded after not even a minute of running. I don't know if he followed. I don't think he did, but in that moment, we were in full-on panic mode. We reached the edge of the lake, and at that point, I was gasping for breath. After a very short break, we made our way back to the car silently, and Kyle drove off immediately. None of us had any idea what we had just seen. Kyle said it was probably someone dumping their trash, but I told him that was ridiculous. Who in their right mind would dress up in a bear suit in the middle of the winter to illegally dump their trash? There was no way. Ricky said it was definitely someone dumping a body, but I told him the bag was way too small for that. The three of us talked about it the whole ride home, but we couldn't agree on a definite explanation. We never got an answer. The reason I'm thinking about this now is because my mom was watching TV the other day and an old missing persons report popped up on the screen. It was a child from around our area, and the timeline of his disappearance matched up pretty closely with what we had seen on that lake. I'm not jumping to conclusions. I know it's a long shot and probably just an unfortunate coincidence, but I can't help but wonder if those two things are somehow related. By the time you're hearing this, we've probably reported our sighting to the police. My wife Cheryl and I own a farm in Buckingham, Iowa, where we mainly grow corn. This was in August of 2018 on a slightly rainy night. Cheryl and I have both spent our entire lives in the farm life. It's really all we know. Of course, farm life in Iowa means lots of space and very few people. Our closest neighbors, George and Kenny, were each about half a mile away in opposite directions, also farmers. With not much else going on around here, It's easy to become friends with your neighbors. We often have George and Kenny and their wives over, and vice versa. On this one otherwise normal weekend night, we had George and his wife over for drinks. We all got pretty drunk while playing board games. They left around 11. Luckily, it's a 30-second straight line of a drive home. We continued to drink some wine as we watched one of our favorite movies. We were starting to get tired. We were definitely feeling the effects of the wine. We were most likely just going to fall asleep on the couch cuddled up together when there was a knock at the front door. A knock at the door at this hour was unusual. In fact, it never happened before. But accompanied with the knocks, we thought we could hear a voice say something. I lowered the volume of the TV. We waited for it to happen again. Like 20 seconds later, another set of knocks at the door, followed by a muffled voice saying, "We need help." I was about to get up and open the door when Cheryl shook my arm, and I looked at her, and she made a face and shook her head no. I whispered, "I'm just going to ask who it is." She replied I shouldn't let them know we're home, but odds are they already knew we were home. I went over to the door and asked, "Who is it?" The voice on the other side said through the door, "Oh, thank God, can you open up? We're lost." I said, "Who's we?" And the voice said back, "My wife and I." I replied, "Can your wife say something?" There was a silence for a few seconds. I followed it up with, "Did you hear me?" The same voice said back, "Yeah, but she's not next to me right now." This is where red flags started going off in my head, and I started to realize the voice sounded a little off, like a man trying to make his voice sound a little higher. I laughed and said, "George, is that you?" George is a big goof, and him being drunk, it wouldn't be unheard of for him to do something like this. The voice said back, "Yeah," in a slightly deeper voice now. I almost felt relief, believing that it was actually George, but I didn't want to open the door just yet before confirming. Having someone knock on your door out here late at night claiming to be lost doesn't happen. It's not a thing, and it's an immediate cause for alarm. I said through the door, "Prove it, what's your wife's name?" A now unfamiliar voice said back, "That's a trick question." My smile disappeared. I went to get my phone and called George. Cheryl was watching the whole thing, telling me we should call the police. I said, "Hold on." The phone rang like 3 times before George picked up. Right away, I said, "Are you at my front door right now?" And he said, "No, why?" I told him there's someone at our front door trying to trick me into opening it. He said he'll hurry right over, and we hung up. Keep in mind, all of us were still drunk during this. There were knocks again at the door. I yelled, "I have a shotgun waiting for you if you don't leave here now." The voice said back, "We're just trying to use a phone, that's all we need." Cheryl called 911, which out here, it takes an extremely long time for an officer to arrive on scene. We heard footsteps walking around our wooden deck that wraps around the house. A couple sets of footsteps, actually. They stopped at one of our windows, which had the blinds closed, and we heard one of them attempting to lift the window open. This caused Cheryl, who was still on the phone with 911, to scream, "Leave us alone." I followed suit and screamed at the top of my lungs to get the fuck out of here or I'll shoot you. It took me that long to think to run upstairs to grab my shotgun from the closet. Literally a few seconds later, there were more pounds at the door, and this time it was actually George's voice yelling, "Open up." I let George in, who also brought his shotgun. He said he didn't see anything or anyone as he pulled up. He stayed with us until a police officer came to the house. He did a quick little scan of the property with us, then left. We took heed of his advice in installing a camera in the front and back. Surprisingly, something we never thought of until this incident. Still gives me chills that all that was keeping out whoever was on our front deck that night was a wooden door. This story takes place at my grandparents' farm in the summer of 2018. I was alone one night since my grandparents were away. I was getting paid to watch the farm for a couple nights. On the last night, I was watching TV in the living room when I started to hear a strange noise coming from outside in the cornfield. At first, I shrugged it off because I figured it was most likely a deer. That was until I heard all the cows start mooing at the same time. Usually you would hear maybe one cow moo at a time, but when every single cow starts mooing, then something is wrong. Something or someone would have to startle them to make all the cows freak out like that. I was the only one at the farm, so it was of course my job to see what was going on. So I went to the closet to get a coat on and go outside, But just as I was about to go outside, I heard a very high-pitched cow scream. I stood still for a while, shaking in my boots. Something terribly wrong was going on with the cows. I quickly ran upstairs to my grandpa's room. Under his bed, he always keeps a few guns. I loaded his hunting rifle and went outside. The cows still would not stop mooing, so I went into the barn to check. There was nothing out of the ordinary. All the cows were still here. That was until I walked further down and noticed that one cow was missing from his stall. It didn't make sense. I was sure he was tied up to the stall the last time I saw him. Then I thought I could hear a cow make a high-pitched moo sound from the cornfield outside the barn. So I went outside, but while I was walking to the field, I swear I heard what sounded like people talking. I finally had enough of this. I fired 2 rounds into the air. Everything went silent. The cows were quiet, and I couldn't hear anything from the field. That was until I heard the footsteps in the field. I didn't know if I had the balls to go inside the cornfield, but I had to do it anyway. This is the exact reason farmers have guns, and I couldn't just hide inside the house with trespassers in the field. I started to walk into the crops, and I could hear many pairs of footsteps all beside me. I was getting even more freaked out as I continued to walk deeper into the field, and then I froze. Down one of the rows of corn, there was a person in all black standing a few feet away from me. I rose my gun up, telling him to get out of my field. I wasn't bluffing, I was ready to shoot, but he never moved. So I fired another round into the air to scare him off, but he still didn't move an inch. Then he actually started walking towards me with his arms slightly out, as if telling me to lower my weapon. I aimed my gun at him again, screaming at him to go away. And that's when I made the horrible realization that I was surrounded by people dressed in dark clothing, like at least 6 or 7 other people. That was only the people I could see, who knows if there were more. And as the one guy got closer, I realized something. He, along with the rest, were all wearing these creepy masks. The man stopped approaching me as I started stepping backwards. They all stood in silence for a moment. I cannot explain the fear that I was experiencing. I thought I was about to be killed. That was when they all started chanting something. I couldn't understand it. It sounded like a different language, but the chants almost sounded like a song, and I started wondering if they were about to perform some kind of sick ritual on me. That was when I took the opportunity to run as fast as I could down a few rows of corn. When I was out of breath, I stopped and fired about 6 rounds in their direction. I heard a bunch of footsteps and rustling crops going in the opposite direction. I finally scared them off. I ran back towards the direction of the farmhouse and stopped. I saw something on the ground, and what I saw has stuck with me, scarred me. There was a cow head sitting in the middle of a circle of candles. I wanted to yak, and as soon as I got back to the farmhouse, I did. I grabbed the house phone and called the police. I told the operator everything to the best of my ability. She said that an officer would be there soon. After I got off the phone with the police, I called my parents explaining the situation and asked them to come pick me up. My dad said he'd be there in an hour. I sat upstairs in my grandpa's room, shaking and crying at the same time, waiting for what felt like an eternity, until I finally heard a police car outside. I ran outside to the officer and never felt happier in my life. I told everything to the officer. He searched the barn and then a little bit of the cornfield, and he found the cow head. He called up a search team after that, as this was now an active crime scene. When my parents arrived, I, along with the first officer, had a talk with them about everything that happened. Thankfully, my parents took me home after that. My grandparents took this very seriously, of course, and installed a high-tech security camera system all over the farm. Who knows what kind of group that was, but clearly they were doing some kind of animal sacrifice ritual or something. I just happened to be the unlucky one home alone on the farm they chose to do it at. My name is Howard. I'm 25 years old, and I live on my family's farm. I help take care of it when my parents are out of town. It's just a little family farm, not a commercial farm or anything like that. My parents want me to take it over when they're too old to take care of it anymore, as I'm the oldest of 3 and the only son. But honestly, I don't really want to. I don't see myself staying in the middle of Arkansas my whole life, and especially not after something really weird that happened only last July. My parents were on a romantic trip for a week, and so it was my two sisters, Crystal and Morgan, and I taking care of the property while they were gone. There's not much around here, lots of privacy and such, a little too much in my opinion. Except for this one night. It started later on in the night, as it was approaching time to go to bed. My sisters do college online. Crystal takes summer courses, and so she was in her room on her laptop doing work. Morgan and I were just hanging out watching some dumb show in the living room. All three of us kind of want to get out of the farm lifestyle. Me especially, since I'm oldest and in the prime of my 20s. One dreaded part of farm life is the predators, though. Not just the animals that come and eat your produce, but the people that come and steal from you. Believe it or not, it happens. It hasn't happened many times to us, but it does happen. We have a few guns in the house for this exact reason. Our two dogs outside suddenly started going crazy in the backyard. Something spooked them for sure. I first thing went outside to the yard to see what they were barking at. They both were looking in the direction of the crops, going crazy. I yelled at them to shut up, and they went quiet. I stepped right in front of the crops and listened. I heard a whistling from inside of the cornfield. It was undoubtedly a human's whistling. This was the first time I was experiencing a trespasser on the property with my dad not here. I had to hurry inside to get one of the guns. The dogs started barking again. I told my sisters that someone's outside in the cornfield and I had to go chase them away. They both said that was a terrible idea to go run into the cornfield in the dark, and they knocked some sense into me when I realized they were right. I also realized how downright terrifying that would be. So instead, I went out back to the dogs once more going crazy, barking in the direction of the crops. I aimed the gun into the air and fired off a shot which echoed into the night, silencing the dogs. I also was on some kind of power trip in the moment and screamed out to get off our land as loud as I could. I felt that would have done the trick and went back inside. My sisters were both laughing, which caused me to laugh too. But our little laugh amongst each other didn't last long, because the dogs started going crazy again, even crazier this time. I went back outside, ready to do the same thing again, but I felt my heart skip a beat when I saw the guy standing about 20 feet from the dogs, right in front of the cornfield. He looked at me and I screamed, "Hey," at which point he ran into the cornfield. I started running over and fired another shot into the air. I stopped by the dogs. There was no chance in hell I was going in there. I wasn't about to leave the dogs out here either. I unclamped their chains from the hooks and brought them inside the house. I told my sister someone was sneaking around in the cornfield. So what did we do? We called our dad. He told me I had to be the man of the house and protect my sisters. He recommended I fire another warning shot outside if whoever it was came back. After this, we all just gradually went to our respective rooms. My sisters each brought one of the dogs in their rooms, and I brought the gun in my room, just because we were all a little spooked by this. I had the window open, and as I was laying in bed watching a movie on my laptop, I heard a whistling from outside. I hurried to the window and looked out to see someone slowly walking in the grass. Then, like he had some sixth sense, he stopped walking and turned to look at my window, still whistling. This jerk was obviously trying to mess with us and scare us. A very stupid idea when I already made it clear I had a gun. I ran to grab the gun off the bed and aimed it out the window. I shot at the grass a few feet away from him, purposely missing, of course. This cut his little horror movie act short, and he ran out of view of my window towards the front of the house. This time he didn't come back. He'd have to be a fool to come back after that. I obviously told my sisters why I shot, and I assured them he would not be coming back. We never found out who it was or why. It could have been some teen or multiple teens just trying to scare some innocent farmers for fun, or it could have been an actually dangerous person.